We'll get started here. First item is a roll call. We've got some new members. Welcome aboard. We'll start off at this end. Just say your name and present here.
Tom Du Bois, liaison, council liaison.
Greg Scharf, present.
Lauren Siegel, present.
Lisa Forsell, present.
Deanna Herb, present.
A.C. Johnston, present.
Don Jackson, present.
Lauren Smith, present.
Thank you. And I don't see any notes on oral comments from the public, oral communications. Okay. Next item is approval of the minutes. Only some of us were here for that. Are there any comments on the minutes from those who were here? Motion to approve?
I move to approve the minutes of our May 1 meeting.
I second.
All in favor? Okay, great. The revised agenda is here. In conversations with Dean and Jonathan on Monday, we moved some of the things later in the agenda that require less brain power. Unless there are objections, we'll go with this revised agenda. Reports from commissioner meetings and events. Is anybody? Okay, all right. General manager, oh, pardon me. I think when you revise, oh, here we go. Yeah, general manager of utilities report.
Thank you, Chair Denneher. Welcome, new members of the committee. Thank you very much for volunteering your time and stepping up and being part of this commission. It's great that all of you are present and here, and we look forward to getting your input as we move through this year and following years on this. So again, thank you very much for taking the time and being part of this commission. So I do have a couple of items that probably might interest yourselves, as well as we're finding more and more coming from our residents. And this has to deal with the PG&E safety power shutdown programs that they've been talking about. There is Pacific Gas and Electric is distributing letters to the utility customers throughout the Bay Area and about the company's policies and safety shutting down their power. So considering the growth and the threat of the extreme weather and the intense fire over the past few years, the company plans to shut off major power lines in the event of extreme fire conditions. PG&E does not serve the electricity, as you well know here, so we've asked them not to notify our customers because we want to do that from a more personal level. But however, that is going to be something that we've been talking about. We've met with PG&E a couple times now. We still don't have really the true understanding about what their notification process will be to the city at that period of time. These transmission lines, as they come up out of the north and out of the south, you know, there's not one finger that just comes to a community. It's long lines that will start up in the north, and then they come down through the Bay Area and then continue on down south. And so our concerns is that, you know, what kind of notification are we really truly going to get from these, from PG&E? Are we going to find out that it's just going to be that we're on that grid and on that transmission line and they're going to shut it down, and then we're totally black from a city standpoint? So with that, Assembly Member Mark Berman is going to have a wildfire town hall meeting on June 22nd from 9 to 11, and it's going to be at the Portola Valley Community Hall. And PG&E is going to be part of one of the panelists that will be talking a little bit about their plans. I'm not sure how much plans that they will share at that period of time, but I think that it'll open up some more communications and some questions about what they're truly going to do, and specifically for ourselves is how's that notification going to come across so that we can then figure out ways of getting the word out to the residents and through media, through blast of emails and items like that. Also, CAL FIRE will be there, Cal OES, San Mateo County officers and emergency services, Woodside Fire Protection, Fire Marshal will be talking. It's from 9 to 11 on June 22nd, and it'll be at the Portola Community Hall in Portola Valley. So if any of you are interested in attending, feel free. But again, I'm going to attend, and my plan is then to bring back in the general manager's meeting notes at our next meeting to get a little bit more information. And like I said, we also have an internal working team that we're looking at with other departments as well, so that we can also talk about a little bit about our own issue with one line that runs from basically the base of 280 going west up through the hills. We do have a 12,000 volt line that runs up through there. One of the things that we are looking at this period of time, we are in the plans of actually putting what they call a reclosure at the foot of 280, and then we'll be able to operate that through SCADA. So if there was high winds or if there was some type of fire danger or something that would happen, we'd be able to remotely shut that off. And we can control that ourselves. That's within our distribution system, but we feel that the importance of this, as this rises, that we will take those precautionary efforts. And again, we can control the message that's being sent out to the customers that are up on the hill. Again, it only affects, what we did was we only affected the area that's going to be from the base of 280 going up through the hill up onto the west side up to Skyline. There's about 60, 70 customers that are up there on the hill approximately that line feeds. So we would impact those 60, 70 customers at that point. Some of the workshops from the last UAC meeting is that there was electric vehicle right for you. We sponsored an EV workshop and partnered with Stanford Health Improvement on May the 26th at the Mitchell Park. Some of the topics that were talked about was the difference between the all-electric and the plug-in hybrid EVs. And then also talked about EV charging at home and work and public spaces. And then they also talked a little bit about battery longevity in these vehicles, what type versus buying versus leasing these type of vehicles. There was about 100 attendees, and there was also a number of EVs that folks were able to view and talk to the representatives from those makers. There was a irrigation upgrade and landscape water efficiency that was held on May the 11th. Attendees learned irrigation equipment upgrades that can help improve the water efficiencies, as well as learning just how to put in an irrigation system. And then on June 1st, this past Saturday, there was a maintenance native garden and leak detection. We'll talk a little bit more about leak detection in tonight's presentations. Was held, again, like I say, on the June 1st. About 75 attendees were there and learned how to create a beautiful low water use of low maintenance landscaping. They presented some design concepts as well as some best practices, and most important was they also talked about leakage, how to detect leakage in the irrigation systems, as well as that's actually inside the home itself, around faucets, toilets, things like that. And then we also videoed, taped that, and then the intent is to put it on the website, so that anybody that wants to look at it, you feel free to go onto the website. Last item really is to talk about EV solutions and technology assistance. So this program will be using LCF's funds to offer full-end consulting, project management service to various commercial customers to install EV chargers. And so the emphasis is really on the low-income, multifamily units and the dwellings for nonprofits, with assistance to contract with clear results, as the program has accepted the EV charging infrastructure at these harder reached areas. The goal of the program is really basically to help us towards the city's sustainability goals and streamline the processes and what we can learn from as we move through. We have a difficult time trying to deal with some of the commercials as well as some of the multi-unit dwellings. Again, trying to get those owners to buy into the idea about installing EV chargers on their premises and things like that. So we think that working with clear results as well as using some of these funds on might be a little bit motivation that they would be willing to put in some EV chargers inside these multi-dwellings and also some in the commercial areas. So with that, that's my report.
Okay, thank you. Next item, the commissioner comments. Ron, Warren, Smith, this agenda item doesn't very often get triggered, but it's a place for commissioners to make comments on any topics not on the agenda. Or matters you might want to do. Are there any commissioner comments? Okay. No unfinished business? Thank you. Next item is election of officers. We had some discussion about using the incumbents this year. A lot of people get up to speed on things. And so, AC, do you have?
I don't know whether you want to take the chair and vice chair separately.
One resolution would be fine.
So I would nominate Michael Danaher to remain as chair and Lisa Forcell as vice chair.
I'll second. Do we need a second, or do we
I
just vote?
second would be fine. And then any discussion on that, or? Okay, then all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, good. We're ahead of the agenda. All right, 12 minutes ahead of schedule. Here we go. Discussion of electric vehicles and building decarbonization.
Good evening, Commissioners. Jonathan Aubenshine, Assistant Director of Utility Resource Management, and I'd like to tell you why we brought this item to you. Over the next year and a half, and you'll get a lot more information from this presentation, but over the next year or so, you're going to be seeing a lot of discussion about the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan update. And so what we'd like to do is give you an idea of the citywide efforts that we have going on around building decarbonization and electric vehicles right now. Now, of course, these will change as we update over the next year, but I think getting a good baseline for the commission right now will be a good idea. The other reason is that we're going to be talking to you about customer programs later in the summer, and so we'd like you to have a sense of the context in which these programs, these customer programs that we run, are dwelling to some extent. So, with that, I'll introduce Hillary Rupert, who is a consultant with the city, and is managing our electric vehicle sustainability implementation plan, and then Christine Tam, a senior resource planner with Resource Management Division, who manages the building decarbonization.
All right, so we have a few speaker cards here, and I think maybe hearing concerns from people who'd like to speak first, then perhaps you can address their comments or concerns in your presentation. So let's do it in that order. There are several people who wanted to speak on agenda item 2. David Cole.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to address the UAC. This is a little backwards from council. Usually the presentations go first, but I did have a chance to see the slides, and I want to thank staff very much for a great presentation, which we're going to hear in a little bit. They covered a lot of great issues. On the cost, when they talk about barriers to EV adoption, EVs can be less than your cell phone if you get the right lease options. So this is a matter of education, and the Ride and Drive program has been really key to getting larger participation in that, so I really support that. On the EV parking, this is where the city has conflicting ordinances. There's a state one that says if you put in EV parking, you have to have so much handicap space, EV parking available for charging. Since most of the lots are parked at the minimum number of spaces, then the city planning department said, no, can't do it because you'll be below the minimum now if you put in these EV spaces. So this is the city shooting itself in the foot as it tries to promote EVs. This is really easy, simple thing. Maybe the city manager or somebody else just has to say, okay, there's an exception for this. But it has really stopped some of the EV charging infrastructure from going into the city because of these parking minimums, which they're all parked at the minimum because they don't want to spend any extra space. And then the EV mandate from the state says you have to have handicapped, and now they go below that. So I would like the UAC to please address this with the city manager and the council and get rid of this silly roadblock. On the comments for the SIP energy, another great presentation. I think the key thing that we can do for that is the REACH code. And the REACH code has to require all new buildings and small businesses be all electric. We can't do anything less than that. Climate change is moving faster than most governments can operate. And this will continue to be the case. The IPCC report says that the actions to take to address climate change must be rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented. This does not describe most governments. And so the work that you need to do, that we need to do as a city, is going to feel uncomfortable because it's outside our normal range, but we have to do this. There's been already one preliminary study that shows that it's cost-effective to go all electric. And the other thing about that, for the utilities to think about, is that if we continue to install natural gas to the home, we're installing stranded assets because it's just a matter of time before we have to phase out of natural gas. And so to continue to do that, and for the UAC to say that we're going to continue installing on new homes when all electric is an economical, cost-effective alternative is just lunacy. We need to also start to pay the price of that decommissioning of the natural gas system. If we're not paying that now to all customers, when we decide to phase that out later on, the bill's going to be enormous. And we're essentially not paying the true price of this service. So this is very important. The UAC is usually very good, and utilities are very good at forecasting down the road what costs are going to be and making this level across the years. This item has been skipped over, and it needs attention right away. Those are my main points on this, and again, great presentation by staff. Thank you.
Good evening, and thanks also for the opportunity to speak to you about the presentation from staff on the SIP for EV and buildings. I'm a member of Carbon Free Palo Altos and also just kind of a squeaky wheel in the city for environmental and climate action for the last 15 years. And I really like what the staff is going to present. I'm pointing to a few slides because I assumed that the comments would come after the presentation. But just to go through the comments that I would have, and maybe they'll come up when you view the slides. I think there's a trade-off between the EV strategy and the mobility strategy. So I think that we should keep in mind, maybe not in this presentation, but there's EV investment support SOV as a mode of travel, especially in residential. So if you're installing chargers at residential locations, that's normally for someone who has their own car, owns their own car, and drives that. So you've got then a commitment to roads and parking for that car. The mobility strategy is designed to reduce SOV as a mode. So to some extent, you can reduce your exposure to have to invest in EV charging if you promote mobility and the reduction of SOV travel. So that's something I think we should keep in mind in terms of the investment in EV charging equipment, whether that should be more residential or more public, and commercial may be able to repurpose to public and shared vehicle transportation more than domestic charging. The next point I would make on the building side is that the slide we have on slide 3 is the first time I've seen presented the goals for 2030 for the city to reduce natural gas use by use. So the bottom table there, if you look at that, it shows basically 80% reduction in the use for these purposes: water heating, space heating, etc. And then you contrast that with the last slide of the presentation, which is basically showing how much is going to have to be done by the residents to reach that goal. So every resident is going to have to adopt, and that means putting down a lot of money and a lot of effort in adopting electric solutions for their water heating, for their space heating, for cooking, for clothes drying, whatever it is. So there's a graph at the end where you'll see there's a huge gap to be filled to reach 80/30 that needs to be basically performed by the residents of the city, the users of that natural gas. The only way that we know to reach that is to provide a very easy solution for residents to do this. So we have to make it very easy for them to buy an electric heat pump water heater. There has to be no upfront cost because that's a huge barrier for many of our residents. And it has to be proactive, meaning we can't wait for business as usual and just to keep installing gas appliances because that's what the contractor has in the back of his truck when he pulls up to replace your broken water heater. We have to take an inventory of these buildings, all that equipment, provide a plan that rolls out a complete solution that's easy for customers to adopt. And Carbon Free Palo Alto has put forth a proposal called Be Smart, which self-finances this on your bill. So you wouldn't have to pay an upfront cost more than it would normally cost you to replace a gas appliance. The utility is responsible basically for coordinating the delivery of that solution, and it becomes at a proactive manner, meaning you get identified and they know roughly when your equipment is going to be end of life. And a lot of these solutions are cost effective now, so it is self-financing, it's scalable, everyone could adopt, and some of the elements are already in place that staff is presenting, namely the concierge service, which I think might be described or mentioned. It's in the appendix, but it's an important way to take away the complexity and the difficulty of getting electrification done for buildings in Palo Alto using the ability of our own utility to simplify and make that a very long-term profitable payback scenario for the public. So I'm directing attention to the solutions that staff is putting forward. And the one objection that we've had to our proposal for this kind of mass electrification has been billing systems. We're trying to promote this to Southern California, Edison, to most of the CCAs that are around our area and other parts of California. And billing systems seem to be a very big issue, but we know there are workarounds, and that should not be an excuse to making progress on climate change. So hopefully I planted some thoughts in your head to think about as we're going through the presentation. Sorry for kind of jumping the gun here. But anyways, I commend staff. It's a really great presentation. It's really getting to the root of meeting 2030 and standing up as Palo Alto to really roll up our sleeves and get this done.
Thanks very much. Tom, you noted agenda items 2, 3, and 4. Is this all, you want to be called up 3 times or?
Yes.
Okay, all right, great.
Thanks. Thank you very much. It's great to see you all again. I'm Tom Cabot, a member of Carbon Free Silicon Valley, a little volunteer group trying to help cities pursue their carbon targets. And then also I sit on Menlo Park's Environmental Quality Commission, so I get to hear what it's like to hear people come in and make the proposals and try to look at these things. I'm also very impacted by that report that David mentioned, the fall 2018 IPCC report, which he mentioned the things it does, which are an anathema to me as a 30-year staff member of Palo Alto. We like to move slowly and carefully and take little steps and to do things that were well precedented. They said innovate, but they always told me to innovate by following other people who had already done it. And so I see that when we're going to tackle the climate problem, we have to go against those natural tendencies for city staff. So I'm really proud of the staff's report here that's putting this information out in front of you where you can help guide them towards the aggressive attack needed to really stand up to the climate fight and then to set the example that needs to be set. from my work with many other cities through the Silicon Valley Clean, or Carbon-Free Silicon Valley, I'm able to see all the other cities looking to Palo Alto for leadership. So it is working. You know, you are able to set a standard and get out there and show people what can be done. But when you get to slide 3, it's got a bar chart in the bottom that shows percents of things that need to be achieved by the year 2030. And one of the interesting things is all of the retrofit work that has to be accomplished in the upper 4 or 5 bars of that chart. And then the bottom bar is new buildings. And it has the nice thing, by 2030, all of the new buildings will be fully electrified when they're constructed, so they won't have to be retrofitted. But if you start thinking of the high cost of retrofitting buildings once they're built, it really makes you want to immediately jumpstart all that new construction policy to get it done right the first time, to, as David said, avoid stranding the wrong assets in buildings. So that's, I just wanted to share that one concept, and thank you very much for setting this up.
Tom, thank you. All right, Hillary and Christine, please.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Hillary Rupert, and I am a sustainability and management consultant. The city of Palo Alto brought me on in 2016 to build out the electric vehicle strategy and implementation plan for the city. But before I dive into that, I want to say thank you for having me here tonight, and thank you to the comments from David and Brett and Tom. They're very good, and I will do my best to address them throughout the presentation, but if for some reason I miss the mark, please let me know, and I'll try to do better for you. Now, before I dive into the sustainability or into the EV plan, I want to talk to you about the Sustainability Climate Action Plan and set the stage. I recognize a couple of faces who were along a part of this journey with us when this first started. But for those of you who weren't a part of this initial journey, let me just tell you, the city of Palo Alto was a leader in this space and developed the first climate protection plan in 2007. So that was 12 years ago, well, almost 12 years ago when that was established. It adopted the Sustainability Climate Action Plan, what we often refer to as the SCAP, in 2016. And it consisted of really 3 components. Now, the first component is the 80 by 30 goal. And when we talk about the 80 by 30 goal, what we're saying is we need to reduce 80% of greenhouse gas reduction by 2030. And this is based upon the 1990 calculations. And this is a very aggressive goal. And again, it goes to the leadership because the state goal is 80 by 50. So that's a 80% reduction by 2050. Now, as of 2017, the numbers that I have are that Palo Alto has reduced the greenhouse gas emissions at an estimated 43% from the 1990 baseline. So we're charting good progress, but as Christine will talk to you more in the assumptions graph, there's a lot more work that we need to do. So that's the first component of the SCAP. The second component is really the SCAP framework. And these are really the guiding principles, the decision criteria, and the design principles as really the roadmap for how to implement the plan. And then that ties into the third component, which is the 2018 through 2020 Sustainability Implementation Plan. And that came before Council in December of 2017. It was approved, and staff immediately started putting together the implementation plans and started working towards these goals. Now, the implementation plan, I'll just ask you to look at the slides. It consists of 4 action areas, and those are energy, water, mobility, and electric vehicles. And the 2 key, at the high level, the 2 key components are CO2 and H2O. Now, for each one of these action items, there are goals associated with them, there are teams associated with them. Staff is working towards implementing actions to reach the goals. And with that, let me pass this over to Christine to talk about the assumptions and what we need to start working on.
Hi, my name is Christine Tam. Good evening, Commissioners. So I think this slide has already been referenced multiple times by the public, by David, Brad, and Tom. When we talk about our 80% by 2030 goal, oftentimes people ask, well, how are you going to get there? What do you need to do? What are the measures that you're talking about? So inherent in the SCAP, there are a lot of assumptions about what the city will need to do. And that is kind of summarized in two areas, mainly in the EV goals and also in building electrification goals. Between EVs and building electrification, that accounts for over 98% of the assumed greenhouse gas reductions for to meet the 80 by 30 goals. And as you can see in this slide, the bulk of the reductions is going to come from the EV side, with both vehicles inside the city of Palo Alto as well as vehicles coming into the city. These are commuters coming into the city every day. We are expecting that to meet those goals, we need that 90% of vehicles in Palo Alto needs to be electrified, and half of the vehicles coming into the city needs to be electrified. And then on the building side, as you can see in this chart, the primary greenhouse gas emissions sources comes from hot water, space heating, and cooking. Those are the three end uses that uses natural gas. And we do need to electrify most of these water heating, space heating, and cooking appliances in both commercial and residential buildings. So there's a lot of work that we need to do. And then we'll get into the EV SIP key action areas and the energy SIP key action areas to discuss how we're going to meet these goals.
Great, thanks Christine for that. So the 8 key action items that are associated with the EV SIP, the way that I would like to do this presentation, I don't want to take you too far down in the weeds because we don't have a great deal of time. So I'd like to keep this fairly high level, but of course, if you have any questions, please let me know. But the way this slide is set up, it will show the action items, and then in parentheses, you'll see DS, UTL, S, PW. Those are the various internal city departments that are also a part of working on these action items. So DS is obviously development services, UTL is utilities, S is sustainability, and then PW is our public works department. So there's a tremendous amount of organizational organizational effort that is going into implementing and driving the EV SIP. So our first action is to publicize streamlined permitting and CPAU-funded transformer upgrades. And so really at a high level, what we're talking about here are policy reviews and procedure streamlining. The second EV goal, or rather action, is to consider EV readiness and charger installation in existing buildings. And this really goes to, let's get it right the first time around. Retrofitting is expensive, it's timely, oftentimes it's not possible, and folks really don't want to do it. And so let's look at things the first time around and make sure we're building smartly, make sure we're building for the future. And so because of I don't want to say resistance, but because of some of the challenges associated with retrofitting, what we are doing in that area, we're providing education around retrofits and looking at any possible incentives that could be offered in that area. EV3 relates to evaluating the programs to expand EV charger deployment on private property, and Dean set us up in his opening remarks quite well for some of the programs that the Utilities Department is working on in that respect. We have the Clear Result contract. A highlight as a result of the LCFS funds are that 28 applications have been submitted for EV chargers in low-income multi-unit dwellings. and nonprofits, and 7 sites as of the end of Q1 2019 have received those rebates. So we're seeing some good progress there.
Action item was to streamline the permitting and these applications submitted. Why don't you educate us, and what's the process for that as an applicant? How long does it take? How much work?
Yeah, the application process can be rather lengthy, and it goes to what David Cole was talking about earlier with the parking and the ADA compliance requirements, and then it depends on the transformers. If there's enough capacity to support the chargers, great. And if not, then you have to go down another path and look at how do we upgrade this transformer? What is that going to cost? How long is that going to take? And so it can be a very lengthy process. A couple of the projects that I've been working on have been in the works for 6 to 9 months or a year. Yeah. It takes quite a long time. And that goes
So the good news is there's a lot of room for improvement.
Yes, there's a lot of room for improvement. But I don't want to make it sound so negative, because the folks are working hard. The teams are working hard. The departments are working hard to try to address this. But yes, there's room for improvement.
Can I ask a question following up David's comments? Because I didn't actually understand what he was saying, because I don't know what the term minimally parked means. Can you just explain? It sounds like there's some math involved with some number of spaces need to be handicap accessible, and that puts a limit on how many EV spaces you can you just walk us through that if it's
So that's yes, Lisa.
Possible?
Yeah, that's a very technical question. And so I would want to refer you to the permitting website, because there are very strict numbers of ADA spaces that you have to have per the number of parking spaces that are in an area. And then it gets into, it's very technical, into the slopes of where the ADA spaces can be located. And then some owners don't have enough spaces to give up so that a space could be designated EV if the installation of an EV charger requires an EV handicapped space. It's a state mandate. This is not anything that's complicated by Palo Alto. This is a state mandate that the city has to adhere to.
Could I just follow up on that too?
Yeah. For new construction, is there any kind of requirement as part of the permitting process that allocate sufficient space to allow for the EV parking, so at least going forward, construction accommodates it?
Yes, Palo Alto currently probably has the most rigorous requirements for EV-ready parking spaces for multifamily buildings as well as commercial buildings. So for multifamily buildings, I think there needs to be one EV-ready parking spot for every dwelling unit, and this actually exceeds the upcoming building code requirement that starts in January of 2020.
So I'm just a little confused too. So we have requirements, obviously state mandated requirements for handicap spaces, but we also have a parking requirement, I assume. We do have a parking requirement for building how many spaces you need. If you do an EV space, do you lose some of those spaces? Or I was confused when you said they don't have enough spaces. Well, why couldn't they put the handicap spaces where the handicap spaces go and then create EV parking spaces? So that's the confusion I'm having.
I think the problem is primarily with existing buildings, and new buildings in Palo Alto are very limited each year. The majority of the building stock are existing buildings, and it's hard to make space for EV charging spots in these existing parking lots.
So, but why?
So maybe you guys can correct me on this, but I think part of the problem is the timing of the space. So, we take this full-time parking space that someone could park 24/7, And now we're going to put this EV charger portion of it, and we're going to put a 3 or 4 hour timeline into that. So now if no other EV charger or no EV car comes into play, we've lost that parking space. So we're diminishing the numbers of spaces because of the timing that is only allowed to park.
I would just add that it also had, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say there's a difference in my mind between requiring the building owner to convert on an existing building, requiring them to convert to an EV space, or allowing them to change it. And if they want to change it because they think in their multifamily or office building they're overparked. I would say there's some buildings that seem overparked. And so therefore, if they want to do it, we should let them. And it's unclear to me if our regulations don't allow that or what's, I'm just unclear what our existing regulations are.
So I think I might be able to shed a little light on it. The issue has to do with equal accommodations. So if you have a single EV charging space, it has to be striped for ADA. And so if you're trying to replace a normal size parking spot with an ADA spot and you're minimally parked already, you have to lose a spot. And at that point, you're not in compliance with the parking regulations, and all of a sudden you have a conflict between the parking regulations and the ADA requirements. So if you have an overparked property, it does work, and we do have some multifamily buildings that have been able to get chargers in already. It really depends on the usage as well. The planning department and building department are taking this up as an issue. It's something I think that's already been in front of the planning commission, actually. Am I right about that, Hillary?
Yes, Jonathan, that went before the Planning Commission 2 months ago. And they're starting to look at this concern, this issue.
Could I ask a quick question? And I just want to understand what you just said, but I've seen spots for EVs that are kind of EV/handicap, and they say like use last for EV, but it seems like EV people can park there even though it's a handicap spot, potentially. And then you just said if they put in one EV spot, it has to be ADA width? Is that what you just said, Jonathan?
Yes.
So, but these aren't, if any EV can park there, it's not really a handicap spot, right?
And I think that's a problem. The way I understand that it works is that you're putting this, you end up with multiple spots. So you have a dedicated ADA, you have your dedicated ADA spot that's already going to be there, and then you have a second EV spot. And because you have to make that ADA accessible in case you have someone with an EV who needs the ADA access, that's where you end up losing the parking spot because you have to widen that extra space out.
Can I make a request that maybe if y'all could follow up to the UAC in email with a link to the webpage where all this is explained? I think that would be super helpful.
Sorry, can I also ask, with respect to the applications that you received in the first quarter, I think you highlighted 20 with 7 approvals. Have you done a breakdown of the types of buildings that were actually applied?
I don't have that information with me, but Hiromi Kelty is the program manager on that.
I think a point of reference on this is, and this goes to the heart of the question. There's a regulatory issue associated with installing EV chargers in general, particularly in older buildings, because it is extremely expensive and there's simply not enough space, particularly in electrical rooms. So it is something that we should take a look at from a planning and buildings department's perspective. Is there a way of fast tracking a building that actually really does want to install an EV, but they're going to take 6 years just to get through the planning commission because they have to go through this different route just to get the building department approval. So perhaps something we should look at.
Yeah, to your point, that this does require interdepartmental collaboration in order to move this item forward. So, and Lisa, yes, I will follow up with the Planning Commission with the links to the information on the requirements and the spacing.
All right, well, thank you for educating us on the parking things. I guess I'm grateful that it's not entirely under our jurisdiction, the building codes, but why don't you continue with the presentation?
Okay, yeah, great, thank you. So I believe we left off on EV4. which ironically is building out the public and private infrastructure. There's anticipated ownership of EVs of between 4,000 and 6,000 by 2020. And so while David or it was actually Brett that mentioned that the EV SIP is in a bit of a conflict with the mobility SIP. I mean, really the goal is to get people out of cars. We would prefer not to have people drive. But if that is simply not an option for folks, we would prefer that they drive an EV, obviously, because of the greenhouse gas reduction. So building out the public infrastructure is really important to supporting the goals around the EV adoption. And so we have some projects in the pipeline, additional level 2, which are your basic EV chargers. So we've got a plan for 26 ports or an additional 13 chargers that will go into city garages. We're in conversations with Tesla on superchargers, as well as in conversations with Electrify America on DC fast chargers. So we've got a lot of moving pieces there associated with EV4. Now, EV5 relates to expanding EV deployment in the city fleet. And what we're really looking at here is operationalizing EVs. And it's been a pretty exciting last year or so with the fleet department, because we now have the electric garbage truck that's being piloted. There's an electric public safety vehicle that's out and about. We also have 2 new Bolts that will be added to the fleet, and those are 100% electric. I mean, these are big wins, and so it's really exciting to see this new technology being adopted within the city. And we've also looked at a 5-year replacement strategy, and we've identified 17 vehicles that could potentially be replaced with electric vehicles. And along with that, though, goes with the EV infrastructure and looking at how to build out the EV infrastructure to support electrifying what makes sense, the portions that make sense of the city's fleet. EV6 is supporting regional EV group buy programs, and this action item, it's been moderately successful, but basically what this is looking at programs and seeking partnerships to do group buys for EVs, and then having the ability for customers to buy them at a discount. There's not a tremendous amount of bandwidth for this one, I'll just be frank with you, and it's not one of the higher priority EV action items. Our 7th one is one that I find personally the most exciting because it's the engagement with the community members, but it's building out the public awareness of EV options through communications, ride and drive events, and as Dean spoke to earlier, there was a successful Stanford Health Improvement Program, electric vehicle education event that happened, and I believe this is the 4th one that the city has partnered with Stanford Health Improvement Program on, so it's very exciting. The city also partners with an organization, a nonprofit called Actera, and they put on the EV Ride and Drive events at the Earth Day Festival, and they also run the EV events for the big Drive Electric Week that happens in September. A couple of other milestones real quickly on EV7. The FAQ web pages on the utilities website around EVs have been updated, and this was quite a lengthy process, but I'm very pleased with the product, and there was a lot of hard work that went into getting this done by the utility staff. And then lastly, there's the EV infographic, which I'll walk through with you in the next slides. And then the last EV action item is to really seek ways to collaborate with other electrification efforts. And so I think that's really great that Christine and I are up here together because there's definitely room for overlap and synergy and better ways that we can think about how to put this together and how to best implement action items for the city. So with that, let me just talk you through quickly the EV infographic. So really the goal of this is to tell the EV story in a very easy way, in a fun way, in a way that folks can really engage with. And this is also meant to be a publicity material that can be sent out to the utilities customers. It can be used at events. It can be used in different ways to socialize where Palo Alto is really on its EV journey. So this is really exciting. Based upon the DMV data and projections, there's an estimated 4,000 EVs in Palo Alto at the end of 2018, and 29% of the 29% of the new car sales in Palo Alto are EVs. And this is coming from that IC.
Does that include hybrids or just full EVs?
I don't have the white paper in front of me, but I want to say that this includes only EVs. But what's really great about this is the ICCT white paper. It's the International Council on Clean Transportation. And every May, they put out a California report. And I've been tracking this for the last few years. And unfortunately, I haven't seen the most recent report come out. So I'm not sure what the delay is. I've reached out to them several times to ask, where's the report? Because it's something that we definitely look at and we analyze as we continue to move along the EV implementation plan. But back to the 4,000 number, you can see there's been great growth, because that's 2.5 times more EVs in 2018 than the city had in 2014. So next, when you're looking at, okay, 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 okay. So barriers. The metrics, are we looking at the right metrics for GHG reductions as we're looking at the sustainability SIP? And Christine did a great job of putting together that assumption slide for us, which will definitely help us look at the metrics that we have in place. Finance and planning haven't always been at the table for the EV discussions, and so as I mentioned, we're beginning to talk with them and ask them to come join us and be a part of the conversation, because this is really important. EV replacement costs are high, and this goes to David's point. So when I put this barrier together, this was related directly to operationalizing the city's fleet. It was not related to the general consumer, and David is correct. It is relatively inexpensive to lease or buy, especially a used EV. So David, thanks for bringing that up. The soft costs of permitting, we've discussed permitting. It's a very lengthy process. We're not getting the EV chargers in place as quickly as we could, which I'll just leave it at that. As we've also discussed already, technology is moving much faster than city policies and regulations, and then the competing priorities, and this is really the big one: EV infrastructure versus parking spaces. And so these are just some of the barriers that we're working through in order to continue to implement our EV SIP. And with that is all I have for you this evening. Thank you so much for your questions and your time.
Yeah. Do you want to go, do you have more to do on the buildings first, or yeah, how do you have this?
Either ways.
Oh, yeah, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll ask questions.
Okay. I'm going to just quickly walk through these 6 key actions under the energy SIP. So within the energy SIP framework, we look at both energy efficiency as well as building decarbonization or building electrification as the key areas. So starting with the top, the city has already adopted our 10-year energy efficiency targets, so we will continue to pursue all cost-effective energy efficiency in all, through both programs. These are voluntary programs, and mandates through building ordinance. And the second action is to encourage voluntary electrification and mandates as appropriate. And again, this is for the 2018 to 2020 timeframe, to help our customers, both residential and commercial customers, electrify their natural gas appliances. And there's a variety of tools that we can use to facilitate this electrification process. Our third action is to look at whether we should be looking to use mandates through the city's green building ordinance and the city's building energy reach code to go after additional energy efficiency savings and also building electrification beyond 2020. The city actually has a history of requiring additional energy efficiency for building standards beyond what the state of California requires. So this is something that the Palo Alto has already taken a leadership in. And we will be looking at the next building cycle, which starts in January 2020, and we're also looking at going beyond what the state requires. The next one is looking at programs. These are voluntary programs and technical assistance programs that can result in additional energy savings and electrification beyond 2020. And then the second to the last one, the construction of a replacement facility for the sludge incinerators. That has already been done. In fact, today was the ribbon cutting ceremony for the new facility. And that facility has in the past been the single biggest source of municipal greenhouse gas emissions. So we can check that one off. And the last one, as a transitional measure, the city has been purchasing carbon offsets to match the natural gas emissions from the city's consumption. So focusing on just the building decarbonization area, I wanted to kind of briefly go through this framework, how we go about decarbonizing buildings in Palo Alto, meeting the goals in the assumption slide. The city has a variety of tools in our toolkit, starting with education and outreach to our customers on one end, to piloting programs to facilitate the adoption of electrification for our residents and our businesses. And we also provide building code support. So in the current building code cycle, we actually encourage all electric new construction building by we make it harder to meet the code if it's a mixed fuel new construction project. And if the time is ripe and if the community is amenable to mandates, we will start looking at mandating clean technologies, and that's something that the public comments also has addressed. We also need to look at the needs of our low-income community and the hard-to-reach customers, including small business commercial customers. And we are very well aware of the different types of barriers that our customers face, starting with the high cost of retrofitting an existing building to our current electric rate tiers that also is not a good motivation for someone to electrify the home. And because Palo Alto is a small city, we need to work with our neighbors in the Bay Area to drive market transformation and also to drive supply chain transformation. So this slide shows a couple of programs and projects that we're working on. We launched a heat pump water heater rebate pilot program 3 years ago. We've actually done a lot of outreach for that program, and we still haven't seen a lot of enthusiastic uptake, so we're still trying to see how we can collaborate with communities in the Bay Area to discount these heat pump water heaters at the distributor level so that plumbers are more aware and more willing to install these water heaters when customers call them up. Green building ordinance, that's something that I have briefly touched on. Within the city's green building ordinance, we have our energy efficiency REACH code, we have water efficiency REACH code, and materials recycling. And the energy efficiency REACH code is the area that we are working very closely. Utilities department is working closely with development services to push for mandates as well as incentives in the code to encourage efficiency and electrification. We launched recently, on Earth Day this year, we launched a induction cooktop loaner program in partnership with Actera. So now any residents can borrow an induction cooktop to try it out, and if they like it, they might consider installing an induction cooktop next time they have their kitchen remodel or for their new construction projects. And the multifamily gas furnace to heat pump retrofit pilot, this is a pilot funded with grants that we received from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District last year. And we are currently looking for candidates, multifamily buildings, primarily low-income housing, to pull out their very inefficient gas furnaces and put in high-efficiency heat pump equipment in the units. So in terms of challenges for building electrification, there are still a lot of challenges. First of all, low awareness among our customers. In our recent survey, the DER survey, to our residents, despite a lot of outreach and workshops, only about 25% of the respondents in the survey indicated that they are familiar with a heat pump water heater, let alone induction cooktop. So there's definitely a lot of work we still need to do to get people to become aware of these alternative technologies and actually be excited to do their own home conversion projects. And customers also think of natural gas as a cheap, clean energy source, and gas prices is projected to also stay low in the foreseeable future. And that is a barrier to building electrification. At this moment in time, there is not much state or federal funding to support building electrification. We've had energy efficiency program funding for many, many years. But in terms of building electrification, the state passed the SB 1477, which supports building electrification, set aside $50 million a year for the whole state. And a lot of that money is set aside for low-income housing as well as for new construction projects. Retrofitting existing buildings is still lacking a good funding source. And heat pump technologies, for the most part, for small commercial buildings and for residential homes, there are very good alternatives in heat pump technologies right now. But for large commercial building over 100,000 square feet, I think that the technology is still not very mature. So we have to see how the market develops these technologies in the next decade or so. And the city, we will continue to facilitate our customers in their adoption of electrification. But at the end of the day, we need every member of the community to step up to the challenge to help the city meet our greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So there's definitely a lot of work ahead of us. Any questions?
So on the EV front, I mean, you were talking about chargers for multifamily buildings, which I understand. But I didn't see as much in there about chargers for people coming into Palo Alto. One of the goals is to electrify half the vehicles that are coming into Palo Alto, or more than half the vehicles that are coming into Palo Alto. What can the city do to encourage more office buildings to have EV chargers in their parking lots?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question. So the city, you're right, the city has been promoting destination charging, but really in the public garages. It has not necessarily been promoting destination charging in the private sector or for workplaces. So we're promoting it for nonprofits or churches, so for folks who come in and work.
It seems to me those are the cars that are coming into Palo Alto that we are hoping to electrify. And this kind of leads to my second question. What do we understand to be the barrier to additional EV adoption? I mean, we've got the early adopters, and there are obviously a lot of them in Palo Alto because of the prevalence of EV ownership already. But how do we get the next group of people? What's holding them back? Is it the lack of charging, or is it the expense of the EVs, or is it the concerns about the range? I mean, it seems to me you need to know what's holding them back so you can figure out how to encourage them.
Okay, so to your first question, insofar as doing the outreach to the private sector, we have that in one of our action items, but we have deprioritized it because we've been focusing more on the multi-unit dwellings and the nonprofits. But that's definitely something that I can flag and definitely have conversations on. Now, to your point about really the second wave of adoption, right, of the electric vehicles and what is the barrier, at this, without having read the most recent ICCT white paper, I'm not sure what the barriers are at this particular point in time, because we're seeing EVs there are over 40 EVs on the market right now, and the range is incredible, 200 plus miles, and not just Teslas. I mean, there are the Bolts, Hyundai just came out with another one, there's the Nissan Leaf with this great range, and so this is a really good question. What is the barrier for the second wave of adoption? Is it because they are just waiting for the right time? Is it because they still have range anxiety? Is it because they're still concerned about where they're going to charge? That I'm not sure. Christine, do you have something?
Yeah, so we have recently completed a residential survey on different types of DER technologies, including EVs. And we ask if they have already bought an EV, and if not, if they plan to buy one. And from the response from that survey, a lot of the objections to buying an EV, these are primarily renters. So renters, they feel that they don't really have a convenient place to charge where they live, and that is one reason why the city has focused the funding available to putting chargers in multifamily units.
So thank you for that, and that makes sense. And obviously, it's important to identify what the major problems are, so that's where you can focus efforts to overcome them.
Just following up a little bit more on your question about our large commercial customers. We, as Hillary said, this has been less of a priority than those because a lot of chargers are going in, just driven by employee demand. We've mainly been focusing on the multi-unit dwellings, but we're kicking off a conversation tomorrow with some of our large facility managers about what they need from us in terms of facilitating discussions around electric vehicles or permitting, sharing stories about permitting issues and trying to smooth some of those out. So maybe not direct rebates necessarily, but possibly conversations, facilitation, maybe technical assistance.
Just a couple of things. So Director Batchelor mentioned the PG&E's plan to basically turn off the grid when they think there's a wildfire issue. Now, I'm skeptical that this would actually affect Palo Alto, but I have no idea. And so I think I'd like to know, if we thought it might affect Palo Alto, how does that affect our plans for using our fleet I mean, I'm thinking if we had all electric police cars and we can't charge them, if we had all electric fire engines and we can't charge them, how does that play into some of this stuff? And do we have concerns with that? And I think we need to at least think about the safety and those kind of issues if we actually had those kind of issues. Now, I'm assuming we don't. And it would just be great if you said, yeah, we've looked at the lines and there's no way, because the entire East Bay goes down, and so we don't have to worry about it. I think we could just put that issue to bed. But I know a lot of the rural communities are very concerned about electrification and are actually talking about, do they want to move to electrification because of those issues? I mean, some places they get snow and there are issues of, people could not have heat, all those kind of things. So I do think that's a concern. I also, 2 years ago, I was at a conference, and I was really surprised. There was someone from the state of California speaking, and they were speaking as if hydrogen fuel cells were on an equal par with, EVs. And I was really surprised, and I was surprised how much money the state is spending on having a network of hydrogen fuel cell charging stations. And I have noticed that some people in Palo Alto actually buy hydrogen fuel cell cars. Some people we may even know. And so the question I have is, we don't talk about it at all, having any infrastructure for that. We've decided that we've basically chosen EV as the technology that we think is correct. And I just wanted to make sure that we think that's correct and we continue to think that's correct, because I know that not all of California, at least 2 years ago, didn't think that. So I just wanted to raise that as something we should at least be sure we're right on. That's my...
Thank you, Greg. Good points. So I have a question on another line. As we look forward to continued EV penetration, I think is probable, but at least that's what's projected here. We're going to have a huge amount of distributed storage available in Palo Alto, and also it's going to represent a huge part of our load in the city if we have, 20,000 EVs or something. And so we're going to want the ability to have those networked where they can be controlled, the charging rates and the like by the city, because if you can do that, you can affect the peak demand. It was meetings with French officials, from Renault and from the major utility in France, and they were saying, given their projections for EV penetration, which were similar to Palo Alto's, that they could take 15% of the CapEx out of their grid if they could control the charging rates of the EVs. So what I'd like us to think about is making sure our EV chargers are future-proofed. So they are networked, they go in, and whether we control them now or someone controls them later, but that we have that capability. Because I think if we turn around in 10 years and a third or half of our chargers are not, we've missed out an opportunity quite a bit, and it'll be very costly for us. Any further? Yes, please, Tom.
Just challenge the committee to think about maybe two things. I think that stat was amazing. It was like the headline for number one in percentage of new cars. I mean, maybe we should do some branding like EV Capital USA and really challenge other cities to beat us. The other thing was we never really talk about gas stations, and I just wonder if at some point you should talk about a gas station strategy, essentially like buyout and conversion. Do we want to eventually not have gas stations in Palo Alto? But that's just a thought.
All right, thank you. Further comments, questions? Then we'll move on to the next agenda item. Thank you both very much.
Okay. So our next item is going to be a continuation from our most recent discussion at the last UAC meeting, and I want to introduce Jim Stack, a senior resource planner, and Lena Perkins, an acting senior resource planner, who are both going to talk to you about our hourly carbon accounting and RPS strategy.
out of the way first. Brett Anderson again. On agenda item number 3 now, Brett.
I'm not as educated as I would hope to have been at this point because I haven't seen the presentation. But from a carbon accounting standpoint, I just wanted to say that we do need to get the numbers right, and we need to be honest with ourselves about what's offset and what's not offset and what's carbon neutral and all of this. And I think we've got actually some pretty good rules in place and have been advertising our carbon-free or carbon-neutral portfolio. But I'd also like to think that we are focused on some things that have very big impact on what our carbon footprint is. And one of those will be discussed tonight. It's fugitive emissions, but not the fugitive emissions that happen in Palo Alto, but the fugitive emissions that are upstream from all our gas supply. And if you're to believe a number that was in the last presentation, it was in the appendix, so you probably didn't see it, but the graph said that the leakage rate assumed was 5%. And a 5% leakage rate means that we're 2 or 3 times what we think we are as far as a carbon footprint for our buildings. So that bar chart will double or triple the minute we take into account the methane leakage for the gas that's being burned in our homes and our buildings. So I think that would be a very important thing to investigate and to agree on how we're going to account for that footprint as far as accounting policy. And the other thing would be to start accounting for the cost of carbon at a rate, some internal rate to be used when we talk about promotion programs or incentive programs for fuel switching, electrification. Some other communities around the country are actually using a carbon cost that's more reflective of the social cost. For example, Washington State just made it a rule that the utilities have to account for the cost of carbon at $68 per ton, which is many times what we're using, I think, for offsets. But that $68 a ton is the federal number for the social cost of carbon. So they're just trying to use that as a way to account for the damage that's done by emitting carbon from our power supply. So I think that's all I have as far as this topic.
Thank you. And then Tom Cobbett wanted to speak again on this.
Yes, thank you very much. And I was here at the last meeting, so I got to hear you start to look at the issue of the different ways of carbon accounting and looking at ways to look under the hood of the carbon accounting and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with electricity. And similar to what Brett's mentioning, Palo Alto, with owning its own gas utility and electric utility, is in this unique position to be able to show some things about the interaction of gas and electric utilities. And to the extent that you've shown an interest in looking under the hood on what goes on with electric emissions, I think it really makes sense to, as Brett mentioned, start looking under the hood as one of your next agenda items will begin at the gas emissions. And there was a backup slide number 28 in the prior presentation. It didn't make it up to the board, but it shows the diagram related to the issue that you're about to address of if the marginal electric supply was gas-fired and we compare it to using gas appliances, which one takes more gas to run to get the same unit of heat out? And it found the electric heat pump used less gas to produce the same heat. And this is just done on an energy basis. Your staff could probably also then incorporate the fugitive emissions carbon dioxide equivalent into doing a diagram like this and back it all up into what is the CO2 equivalent of getting 1 unit of heat through different techniques, either direct burning or through electrification. And you would find an even more pronounced benefit to using heat pumps instead of gas devices. And so, while I don't want us to wrap ourselves around an axle about which hour of the day emissions are a different way and how should we we do things, I kind of think it makes sense to really dispatch your hydro where the market tells you, because the market is reflecting the carbon emissions. But I do think it makes sense to dive in and take that same spirit of analysis and then take a look at how do gas and electric really compare when you look at the big picture and all the fugitive emissions. And then also maybe using the more important 20-year timeline on the how to look at fugitive emissions, which produces a 4 times more serious impact. That 20-year timeline is vital if we're going to be doing the actions that will help us avoid going over the tipping points on the climate problem. So thanks very much, and I look forward to hearing what you say.
All right, thank you, Tom.
Okay.
All right, and let's see, and who do you have with you?
Sorry, I'm Lena Perkins,
Okay,
acting senior research planner. I was
Right.
introduced, and I'll just be quiet for most part.
So good evening, commissioners. Thank you for being here tonight, especially since you're not watching Game 3 of the NBA Finals. We'll try to make this worth your time. So as Jonathan mentioned, this is round 2 of our discussion on carbon accounting. We're also going to be throwing in some RPS compliance strategy topics as well tonight. I first wanted to apologize for a mix-up. I think in your packet last week, you didn't receive the report that goes with this item. I think you saw the presentation, but not the report. We didn't realize that till this morning, so I apologize for that mix-up. You might have gotten to dig into this as much as you normally would, but we'll try to explain everything clearly. So getting into it, the purpose here tonight is to kind of recap what we talked about, what my colleague Lena talked about last month on terms of carbon accounting, accounting for the emissions our portfolio is responsible for. Most of that is kind of just recap, so I can kind of skip over it or go through it real quickly, depending on your preferences. I know we have 3 new commissioners here tonight who weren't here last month for the discussion, but we did actually have a chance to sit down with each of them one-on-one in the past week or so and kind of go through this material. So I'll let you, dictate the speed that you want to go through the first part of the discussion tonight. Next, we'll kind of present some options we have for how we comply with our RPS mandate. And then these topics are kind of interrelated, they interact, so we'll talk about how they affect each other, what the supply cost impacts are of changing our approach to these 2 topics, and how they affect what our customers see on their power content label. We are planning on bringing this back. This is a discussion item tonight. We are planning on coming back in 2 or 3 months with some kind of more concrete possibilities for you to choose from, and we can make that an action item. So tonight we'd like to get feedback on what the items listed here, which are primarily whether we should change our RPS compliance strategy. That's a big ticket item, a lot of financial implications associated with that. And then the next 3 are things we talked about last month, which are whether we should switch our carbon accounting methodology to an hourly approach, what method we should use to clean up the residual emissions that we have in our portfolio in an average year, and how to deal with any discrepancy that our customers might see between our messaging and what they see on their power content label. So I'll start going into the carbon accounting stuff, but please feel free to ask me to skip this or go through that quickly. This first slide shows our supply portfolio and our load, and you can see that our supply portfolio is very lumpy. The top graph is a month-by-month look, and you can see we have a lot of excess supply in the spring and summer months from hydro and solar, and a deficit compared to our load in the winter months. The bottom graphs show an hourly look for a typical January day on the left and a July day on the right. So even over the course of one day, it's also very lumpy. We have large surpluses in July, especially in the evening hours when hydro is most valuable. That's when we tend to dispatch that hydro. And then in the winter, we have kind of deficits in all hours, but those vary as well in size. This is important because over the past 6 or 7 years, the grid has changed dramatically, and the emissions intensity of the grid varies quite a bit with so much solar coming online in the middle of the day. Oftentimes the Carbon intensity of the grid is very low in the middle of the day, and then it's get very dirty in the evening hours when we bring on a lot of natural gas generation. So given the lumpiness of our portfolio and grid emissions, it kind of makes sense to take a little more granular look at our carbon content of our portfolio. So that's what we discussed last month. We talked about some different approaches to accounting for the carbon in our portfolio. The current approach is a simple annual look. We add up the total load over the course of a year and our total carbon neutral supplies, and if they match up, then we consider ourselves carbon neutral. And then the more accurate approach that we think is looking at it on an hour-by-hour basis and looking at our net surplus or deficit of resources compared to our load and weighting those amounts by the carbon intensity of the grid at that point in time. Another dimension is whether we consider unbundled RECs to be carbon neutral or not. So in a dry year, if we have purchases of market power that we have to make because there's less hydro, if we purchase unbundled RECs from out-of-state resources, do we consider that to be carbon neutral or not? And that's something that the state will, starting next year, we have to report in our power content label the average emissions associated with our portfolio, and the state will not consider those resources, unbundled RECs, to be carbon neutral. So that's an added challenge. Skip that slide. This one, there's a lot of material here. This kind of drives home the point that the way we dispatch our hydro resources right now, the graph on the right shows the hourly, month by month net position, where green means we have surplus resources and red means we have deficits and we're leaning on the market. And the hours where we have surplus resources because we're dispatching our hydro in those hours tend to be in the spring and summer in the evening hours, and that's when the grid electricity is the dirtiest. So by dispatching those resources to maximize their value, we're also displacing a lot of carbon from the grid. This slide kind of is the bottom line from last month's presentation. This is an hourly average over the course of the year. So the blue line is our net load. So a positive net load means we are short of resources in those hours. We are buying resources from the grid. Negative means we have an excess of our own carbon neutral resources. And then the red line shows if those are weighted by the carbon intensity of the grid at that point in time, what our, the portfolio's carbon emissions are responsible for. So essentially, if you take the area under that red curve over the course of the year, you get the total carbon emissions associated with the portfolio, which for 2018 was about 16,000 metric tons positive emissions.
Can I just ask how you get negative carbon emissions?
Sure. When we have a surplus of supplies compared to our load, so we're kind of putting more resources onto the grid than we're taking out, we weight those by the carbon intensity of the grid at that period in time. So if we have 100 megawatt hours of extra supply resources and the carbon intensity of the grid is say 10 pounds per megawatt hour, we have we're displacing 1,000 pounds of carbon.
So, and to your point, I know it does not, I apologize for my cold, but I know it doesn't feel very intuitive, but one way to think about it is if Palo Alto's load and Palo Alto's supply resources that we have caused to be built, essentially, were not there, we are displacing more carbon than that other case, right? With our resources that are showing up in the dirtiest times of a grid, and our load is actually distributed in relatively clean times of the grid. And this methodology is actually also recently revalidated by a Stanford study that came out last week using the same methodology and declaring the same result in that you can be net negative, like as a grid citizen, essentially, for a utility. And I do have that study, and we can share that afterwards. and there's a good synopsis, and actually, rather than even the study, the news article does a better job than the study of getting that blurb out.
One thing that's always helped me to understand this concept is to think about the physical system that we're dealing with. So the physics of electricity require that that the amount that you're consuming always equals the amount you're generating. It physically, that's the way that has to happen. And so if we generate extra solar beyond what we're using, and that means that someone's going to have to turn their gas plant down, and that's the carbon emissions. That avoided gas that isn't burned because we generate extra solar is what is being saved by our surplus, and that's how you get to negative. If you have 10% more renewables over the course of the year than you do load, there's a chance that you will end up negative if those are all in the right time to back down gas plants at the right time of day.
Yeah, and that just following on Jonathan's point that, it only works in the context of a broader grid, right? It's not that our electricity is sucking CO2 out of the air, right? Relative to the CalISO grid, we are displacing more carbon than we are causing to be emitted.
Quick question, is the red line on this graph for CAISO or for the city?
It's for the city. It's our responsibility. Yep. All right. So this table shows the end results of our calculations under our current accounting methodology. Let's see. Without considering bucket 1 or bucket 3 RECs, unbundled RECs, we would have our portfolio would be responsible for about 1,600 metric tons of CO2. Under an annual approach, under an hourly approach, looking at it on a more granular basis, it's about 17,000 metric tons that the portfolio is responsible for.
Could you just, and I know you went over it in the staff report, but I still didn't get the difference, frankly, between the marginal emissions and why we're negative on carbon with those, but with average emissions we're not?
Sure. So marginal emissions you can think of as the last unit of generation that's brought online to meet an additional unit of demand. So it tends to be the dirtiest unit on the grid. Whereas if you look at it on an average basis, you're lumping in all the solar and everything, which tends not to be the last unit that you have to ramp up or down. So overall, on an average basis, the average emissions factors are lower, marginal emissions factors are higher. And the reason that our portfolio looks better under the marginal emissions factors is because a lot of our hydro generation is being dispatched in the periods where the marginal emissions factors are super high, so like during the super dirty periods. So that's primarily because of our hydro generation that's hitting those really dirty periods.
So we look better if we use marginal emission factors. But
Correct,
it's not the right methodology, because I know you had a discussion previously, and pretty much everyone I read in the staff report said it's not. But just tell me why it's not the right choice.
Essentially, we have to think of ourselves as being a small player in the overall grid, and you can think of it, if every utility in the state applied the marginal emissions factors to their entire load, the end result wouldn't equal like the total emissions statewide. You have to look at it on an average basis, otherwise you get crazy results.
Okay. So are we just done with the marginal emissions after that? I mean, after this meeting, are we no longer going to talk about it, or? I mean, I'm just wondering why we're still talking about it a little bit.
That seemed to be the consensus last time, that everyone kind of agreed. Yeah, we probably could have left it off this slide.
I mean, this is just a recap. We would continue to talk about marginal emissions in the context of a single, of how we coach individual people to use electricity. So when should you be charging your EVs, for example, if you want to save carbon? The other thing I really like about the average emissions methodologies is that it gradually pushes us to do the right thing with our portfolio, whereas marginal emissions, you're looking good, you're looking good, you're looking good, and then all of a sudden you have a shift. and all of a sudden you look terrible, and that there's not enough lead time to really make good portfolio decisions if you're using that as a methodology.
Yeah, they're more volatile, yeah.
Thank you.
That's a much better way to say that.
Okay. All right, so that was the end of the recap. This, starting here, we have some new material where we kind of take a look at the financial implications of changing our strategy here. So this slide discusses some different tools or methods we could use to abate any emissions we have at the end of the day after we do our accounting methodology. So the tools we are discussing here, starting with the ones we're currently using, unbundled RECs, which are the cheapest by far. Unbundled RECs, so a renewable energy certificate from out-of-state generation. The price of these is around $1 to $1.50 per megawatt hour, which translates to about $3.50 per metric ton of CO2 abated. Other methods are carbon offsets, which we use in our natural gas, Palo Alto green gas program, which costs about $14 a ton. Carbon allowances, where we're sort of purchasing a right to permit, a permit to emit a unit of carbon dioxide under the state's cap and trade program. So we'd be kind of reducing the overall cap in the cap and trade system for the state if we used carbon allowances as our tool. Those cost about $18. And then bundled bucket one RECs, which are in-state renewable energy, and you get the electricity bundled with the REC. You purchase it all together. Those cost about $44 per metric ton under current market prices. So we have some discussion in the report on this, but given the disparity in prices, it's reasonable to ask, our bucket three RECs, unbundled RECs, really legitimate if they cost so little. And that's, kind of a loaded question. There's a lot of philosophical and academic discussion on the topic, which Lena has dived into quite a bit over the past few weeks. But where we come down on this at a staff level is that we think they are legitimate instruments. They do have some real concrete carbon reduction value. The question comes down to, is there additionality associated with these purchases? Do they actually incentivize new levels of generation to be built in these out-of-state regions, Wyoming wind, for example? If generators are only getting $1 or $2 per megawatt hour, does that really give them enough incentive to build new generation out there? And we think, on the margins, it does create some incentive. It also makes it cheaper for states to increase their RPS policies if they see it's not going to cost very much. And I think across the western region, we've seen a lot of states this year ramp up there, like Nevada, New Mexico, and Washington have really increased their targets. Also by, putting new generation in these areas, which tend to be some of the most carbon intensive parts of the US grid, where there's a lot of coal generation still, any additional, wind energy being built in these areas is really backing down a lot of coal-fired power plants. So there's a lot of, you get a lot of bang for your buck if there is new generation being built there. So end of the day, we kind of come down on the side that this is a legitimate strategy to use, that we can, with a straight face, kind of make the argument to our customers that this is a valuable thing to do.
And the additionality argument applies equally to bundled RECs, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So for people to use that to argue for one over the other doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, and part of the reason for the disparity is that the state has imposed limits on the amount of bucket three RECs you can use for compliance purposes, and very small limits. So the state has an incentive to get generation built in state for added jobs and local pollution reduction here in California. So they've kind of put a real big constraint on the amount of out-of-state bucket three RECs we can purchase, which leads to a big disparity there.
I think one of the things that we're wrestling with a little bit is the public perception question. There are definitely people who don't believe bundled three RECs necessarily. They don't believe necessarily the arguments that we're talking about. And I think that Lena in particular has been doing, a lot of research on trying to pull research papers that support the the positions that we're talking about here. And I think the other component of this is actually talking to some environmental stakeholders and actually getting a sense of what the environmental community would think about a position like this, because one open question that I think the community might have is if you have, if we switch our there's a sort of an instinct, to look at the renewable portfolio and want to be able to point to specific sources of supply that are coming to Palo Alto. And this really gets away from that. This says, we're just going to look at carbon, and we're going to have the best carbon impact we can, no matter where that energy comes from. And it's a logical approach, but also a difficult one to explain just intuitively. And if there are environmental groups or environmental stakeholders who are coming out and saying that Palo Alto is greenwashing, that's something that can be problematic for public perception with the community. So we need to look into that a little bit more before we make any firm decisions on our RPS compliance, I think.
Question about translating the cost per ton of carbon to cents per kilowatt hour. Is that a reasonable question to ask? I'm just curious, if we're deciding between unbundled RECs and carbon allowances, for example, and carbon allowances are 5 times more expensive, what's the actual bill impact for a customer between those choices? I'm just realizing as I'm asking it that, of course, it's going to depend if it's a wet year, a dry year, and this and that, but leaving that aside, sort of how many tons of carbon are there in a kilowatt hour? Shoot, this my question is impossible.
Yeah. The next slide actually talks about some of the relative costs of these strategies, but
let's proceed then.
The other part of your question,
I guess the gist of it is just sort of like, how much do these numbers impact customer bills if we make one choice or another? Is it sort of, because they feel like huge disparities, but maybe they're not at the end of the day?
Yeah, okay. So I had one quick question on this, as soon as we're talking about carbon offsets and RECs. So in my mind, it's always been, we buy renewable resources and we have hydro. And that's easy for me to understand. And I realize that electrons are fungible and it all goes into the grid, and it's not the electrons you put in, but we buy solar or we buy geothermal. It just sort of makes sense. So I've always thought that we wanted to sort of move away from RECs a little bit because it's less clear. But what I'm hearing from you guys is that these are, in terms of actually reducing carbon, these are a good way to go, and they may in fact be superior. Am I hearing that correctly?
Again, there's a lot of debate on that, but I think so. I mean, part of that is the fact that we were an early leader in getting a lot of renewable generation built in California. We put a lot of emphasis on getting like hard projects in the ground, long-term power purchase agreements over the past 15 years and getting them built in California. We've cleaned up the grid a lot right now. The grid has changed dramatically. So I think, now we're seeing, some lower hanging fruit out in dirtier parts of the grid.
So if that is true and we actually buy brown power and then we buy unbundled RECs to offset it, right, putting aside the new changes that are coming through, that would make us carbon neutral, right? Why are we then pushing for electrification on our gas utility? What's the difference in thinking? I'm not following it. If we buy carbon allowances, which I guess we're buying carbon offsets. And if carbon offsets are, the trouble I'm having intellectually is it seems to me that we're saying it's okay to buy brown power if you buy carbon offsets or you buy unbundled RECs. And it's okay to sell off our renewable resources and go down on that. But it's not okay to use natural gas and buy carbon offsets. I would need to understand why intellectually that, which seems to me to be conflicting courses of action, frankly.
So Greg, if I may, you're correct. It is conflicting, and these thoughts are going through my mind. And what the earlier presentations were doing, responding to the SCAP policy adopted by the City Council, which was this 80% reduction in this. But in fact, we should be looking at everything on what's the lowest cost way to get to carbon neutral, which is not simply on the supply side, it's also on the demand side, and what are you substituting for? And And it's true, on the gasification, you might do much better, one level with insulation, on another level with, get more benefit with offsets than to pick the highest cost approach to reducing the carbon, which might be, in some cases, the electric heat plant might be the highest cost approach, and you get less bang for the buck. So it's built into those SCAP targets, and maybe they need to be reformulated.
They may very well, but you also then raise a good point, which is, if we think, how is that, what I'm really saying is take the SCAP for electricity. How is that any different than if we sell off our renewables and we move towards carbon offsets or RECs? Why wouldn't that affect the SCAP the exact same way that with gas? I'm just trying to understand what the difference between gas and electricity is. If we're buying brown power on the electric side and we're using natural gas, but we're offsetting it, that's the question I'm asking.
Can I just maybe add one thing? There is one fundamental difference, I think, between what we're doing here and what we'd be doing on the building decarbonization side. So, as Jim said, Palo Alto has already added a lot of renewable energy to the grid. We've done our share. We've done the work to around additionality. We've paid extra to actually add those resources. And so now what we're doing is trading between resources. We've already done the additionality there. It's different on the building energy use in that we're not, if we were to buy offsets and just call ourselves done, there is long-term hard work that's going to have to be done to actually reduce natural gas use. And we haven't done that work yet. We've done it on the electric side. We haven't done it on the gas side. So I think there's an argument to be made there that saving money on the electric side, rebalancing our portfolio, possibly, using some of those savings to fund other sustainability efforts is actually moving us forward, whereas just relying on carbon offsets doesn't move the needle on the hard stuff that's going to need to be done to reach the 80 by 2030 goals, or the state's 80 by 50 goals.
And then if I can just say one thing to your point, Commissioner Scharf, while absolutely backing up everything Jonathan just said, on a physical level, California imports 25% of its energy today, right? And that, and so California, the CalISO isn't an island, and so these RECs are only on the Western Interconnect. We are physically connected with transmission to those areas, and there is now an imbalance market looking to be rolled into a day-ahead energy market. So energy actually being traded and creating a broad market across the Western Interconnect, which didn't exist 5 years ago or when we established this. And while the additionality is really hard to prove on a production cost level, okay, this wind turbine's spinning, and so that coal plant couldn't compete and it turned off, it ran less, for that hour for carbon. These are really, really interesting and complex economic models that are also trying to look at the amount that the wind in particular is cannibalizing coal. Is that actually hastening the retirement of these coal plants? So that knock-on effect of the investment in coal, like long-term speeding up coal leaving the grid, is just another point. So, and it's also, I'm not sure the question, this is my last point, that are these bucket 3 RECs greener than bucket 1 RECs? I don't think is exactly the right posing. I think if it's even an academic debate, if they're close, then we really have to look at, are bucket 1 RECs 15 times the carbon impact? Because that's the dollar per carbon, right? And actually, very last point, we have to think about our electric rates with respect to EVs, which have a massive carbon impact, total house bill, think about that, as well as building decarbonization with electrification. So if this is lowering our electric rates and accelerating EVs and electrification, that's another knock-on for Palo Alto.
So to Commissioner Forcell's question earlier, these are some of the costs associated with the different strategies that we laid out earlier, the impacts on customers. So looking at the right column, using an hourly accounting approach, the portfolio in 2018 had about 17,000 metric tons of emissions to abate. So using unbundled RECs would only cost about $62,000. Using offsets would be about $250,000, and then an increasing amount beyond that. So relatively small financial impact.
What does that translate to in terms of, percentage of rates? Or dollars per month?
Total budget is about $150 million. So $62,000 is pretty tiny.
1%, an ongoing $1.5 million to $1.7 million cost is a 1% increase in rates.
All right. So now I'll shift gears and talk about different renewable portfolio strategy options. This is a slide I've shown many times before, showing the increase in our renewable supplies year by year, starting in 2003. We first adopted an RPS target in 2002. The black line shows the amount that we are required to get under the state mandate. I added a gray line showing our hydro-adjusted requirements. Talking to Commissioner Scharf last week, he brought up this kind of a provision buried in the SB 100 bill that we kind of lobbied for, which allows utilities like us with large amounts of old large hydro in our portfolios, gives us sort of an exemption to come in below the RPS requirement levels that everybody else has to hit. So essentially we have to achieve an RPS level that's the lesser of the regular limit or the amount of our load that's not supplied by old large hydro. So for example, in a year where the requirement is 60%, if we get 50% of our resources from large hydro, we only have to achieve a 50% RPS level rather than 60.
So if I could just elaborate on that. So I lobbied strongly for that provision with our senators, our state senators. And the reason we got that is because we're considered a really good actor. You know what I mean? We're considered that we do things in Palo Alto that are right for the environment. If we didn't have that, they wouldn't have given it to us. And I think that's, when we talk about the RPS and the way this looks, we haven't gotten there, but I am concerned about getting rid of our renewables, because it's easy to tell them, look, we're 50% renewable, 50% hydro, we don't want to spill water for no reason, right? I mean, it's a simpler concept. And I'm not saying we shouldn't look at it, but that is why they gave it to us.
Yep, that's a good point. Anyway, you can see that in the current period, 2019, our RPS requirement is 31%, and we are roughly double that. So we have a large surplus, in the current period right now, going back a few years and going out several more, which was a conscious decision on our part. Council approving all of these power purchase agreements, they directed us essentially to continue purchasing renewable resources as long as we had a need, and as long as they didn't cause our rates to increase by more than ½ cent per kilowatt hour, which they haven't so far. This shows a pie chart of our resources for 2018, where the requirement was 29%, and we had a 64% RPS level. Lots of solar, lots of hydro, even in a drier than average year where we got 40% of our supply from hydro instead of roughly 55. So now I wanted to, bring up some different strategies we could pursue to comply with our RPS requirement. So the current approach is to exceed the RPS requirement by quite a bit, and to do it all with in-state resources. Through long-term power purchase agreements. So these are bucket one resources. Those are the most preferred, the most expensive under the state's RPS market right now. We could choose lower cost options. So going up from the current approach, we could sell some of our resources that are exceeding our load. lately, because our load has been declining, we actually have more resources overall and under an average hydro year than we actually have loads. We could sell some, solar that exceeds our load, for example. We could sell everything that exceeds the RPS requirement, which would be quite a bit more, selling roughly 30% of our load worth of solar this year because it exceeds the RPS mandate.
When it exceeds our load, we're selling it anyway, right?
So there's the portion that exceeds our load. So right now we have roughly 110% of our load in total hydro plus renewables. So we could sell that last 10%, or we could sell everything above the RPS requirement, which is 30%. So we could sell 30 instead of 10%. Bucket swapping is a concept where under the RPS law, we're allowed to satisfy 10% of our RPS requirement using bucket 3 RECs, as I mentioned earlier, the cheaper out-of-state RECs. So we could sell some of our in-state bucket 1 resources and swap them out for cheaper bucket 3 RECs. So there's a small volume that we could monetize there. And then banked RECs. So as I showed in the last slide, we've been exceeding our RPS requirement over the past, almost 10 years since we've had an RPS requirement in place. And every year that we exceed the RPS requirement, we've essentially been taking that excess and putting it in the bank and saving it for a rainy day or saving it to sell later on. So we could, right now we have about 1.2 million RECs in the bank from our 10 years of excess. So we could essentially sell all of our RPS resources for the next almost 4 years and just rely on that bank and monetize that, or we could spread it out, however we wanted to do it. But there's a lot of RECs in there that we could lean on if we chose to go that route. On the other end of the spectrum, on the increasing cost side, we could rebalance our portfolio to make it look less lumpy. We could sell some of those resources like solar that we have that produce a lot in the summer and replace them with geothermal, which produce in kind of a base load pattern, kind of the same output every hour of the year. That would help that would save a little bit of carbon. It would cost more because geothermal is more expensive, but it would kind of balance our portfolio a bit. And then on the far end, we could try to be carbon neutral every hour of the year. And that's the idea where we kind of treat ourselves like an island, and we want to make sure that every time we turn on the lights, these electrons are being matched with generation from our resources that's carbon neutral. So that would involve selling a lot of solar, buying a lot of baseload renewables, and also, most significantly, changing the way that we dispatch our hydro resources to match our load rather than to get the most value. It's not an approach that we're recommending. This slide shows kind of the year-by-year impact, the financial impact on the electric utility from each of these different strategies broken out. So a positive number means an increase in our supply costs. So going to a carbon neutral every hour approach would cost roughly $6 to $10 million per year, we estimate. Below zero is saving money. So the different lines indicate the green line is for bucket swapping. There's about a $500,000 per year of opportunity there. Selling our banked RECs or using our banked RECs would result in about a $2 million a year savings if we use them all up between now and 2030. And then selling all of our supplies exceeding our load is in the light blue line, exceeding the RPS requirement is in the purple line. And then the black dotted line represents a minimum compliance strategy. So that's where we do selling everything above the RPS requirement. We do bucket swapping, and we do using our banked RECs over the next 12 years. So if we went to that approach, it would result in roughly $6 to $7 million per year, or $5 to $7 million per year in savings.
Just a quick question on using the banked RECs. Does that mean we would take the RECs that we have banked and use them instead of buying new RECs? That's correct, yep.
So we would sell more of our current bucket 1 resources and replace them with market power. So it would look.
So what's the price of banked RECs been doing? Is it depreciating? I mean, if the price been falling, so they're worth less every year, or are they roughly worth more? I mean,
No, they're worth essentially what a bucket one rec is worth today. So we would essentially be selling some of our resources today that are generating right now, and using our banked recs to meet our compliance obligation instead of maintaining those recs. So it's about $19 a megawatt hour today that those recs are worth. And we can actually bank them indefinitely. We can apply them in future compliance periods.
So by banking them, we don't lose value over
Correct.
time.
Yeah.
Or we haven't.
They appreciate.
In fact, they're appreciating over time at the moment.
Well, if the market prices increase, which we don't know. Okay, this next table, there's a lot of material here, so I'll pause here for a few minutes. But this kind of is the bottom line. This shows all the impacts of the different strategies that were laid out over the past few minutes. So it shows the supply cost implications, how our RPS level would look, and the carbon implications for the power content label, and under our carbon neutral accounting methods. This is for 1 year, just 2020. So the column on the left is the minimum compliance strategy, where we save about $7 million in supply costs. But because we're using some of our banked recs and selling a lot of our existing resources, we would only have a RPS level of about 21%, but we would still be in compliance with the state requirement, which is 33% for 2020. However, in terms of carbon, whereas the current portfolio, which is the third column from the right, would result under an hourly accounting methodology in negative emissions of negative 45,000 tons of of CO2 emissions. If we went to a minimum compliance approach, we would have a portfolio responsible for 114,000 metric tons, so positive emissions. So a swing of roughly 160,000 tons. And to mitigate those 114,000 metric tons of emissions would require, purchasing bucket 3 recs or another strategy that we chose. If we use bucket 3 recs, that would be a cost of about $400,000, compared to $7.4 million savings. So a small impact relative to the value of selling those renewable resources. Any questions on this? The minimum compliance strategy is the column on the far left. The next 3 columns are kind of the...
Just so I understand it, what we're really doing is basically selling bucket 1 and replacing with bucket 3. That's what the whole strategy is about.
Correct, yep. That's the minimum compliance approach, or the least cost approach, yep. Any other questions here?
I think it's worth noting here that, this is part of the reason that we're expecting to have one more meeting on this whole topic. We're looking for feedback from you on issues around things like bucket swapping now that you're actually seeing the costs, and feedback on which of these strategies may sound attractive. But that said, we're not bringing you we haven't brought you a staff recommendation tonight. We have to go back and sort through, I think, some of these issues and come back to you at a later meeting. So we're not asking you necessarily to make a decision tonight.
Yep. Okay, next, this shows how our power content label, the pie chart showing all of our resources on the power content label every year would look for 2020 under a handful of these different approaches. The current portfolio is in the top left. I should note, because we have a surplus of resources, we can't fit all of them on the power content label, which is why we kind of left off a portion of the hydro, which is why it shows up as being less than about 40% in that pie chart compared to about 60% in the other ones. So if we sold, resources surplus to our load, that's the next one. Selling all of our resources greater than the RPS requirement is the one on the upper right. The red area shows market power purchases. So if we did that approach, customers would see some, unspecified market power purchases on the power content label, which would look kind of ugly. And if we went to the minimal compliance approach, it would look like a pretty significant chunk, almost a quarter of the pie would be from market purchases under that strategy. And then on the increasing cost side, a carbon neutral every hour pie chart is in the lower right. So there's some geothermal and much less solar in that one.
Sorry, and with the buckets, we're swapping bucket 1 for bucket 3 would introduce a market power slice to this PCL, right?
True, yes. I didn't show that one, I didn't call that one out specifically, but that's a kind of a component of the minimal compliant strategy. So the minimal compliance combines selling our excess resources, excess to our requirement, bucket swapping, and using banked RECs. So a little slice of that red from the minimal compliance approach would be from the bucket swapping. Okay, and since we're talking about such a large potential amount of money here shifting around, you know, it's worthwhile to consider what we could do with that. You know, the simplest approach would be just to give it back to consumers in a rate reduction. So a $7 million net savings would result in a rate reduction of about 4 to 5%, or we could hold on to that and defer rate increases for a number of years. Or as Jonathan said, we could use it for some different sustainability initiatives like building electrification efforts, EV infrastructure investments or incentives. We could use it to invest in smart meters, advanced metering infrastructure, or a second transmission line for reliability purposes. So lots of possibilities there. And then, as Jonathan also alluded to a few minutes ago, some of the factors in addition to cost and carbon and power content label to consider are, you know, how these different options would be perceived by customers. You know, would there be issues that customers would have with getting conflicting messages between our carbon neutral claim and the power content label? How do they perceive of carbon intensity? Does it matter to them? And how do they perceive the true value of bucket 3 RECs versus bucket 1 RECs versus unbundled resources? You know, is there additionality there, or can we rely on that?
Sorry, Jim, I have a question. With respect to your supply cost impacts, your chart here, and speaking specifically to the minimal saving $7 million a year, if you look at this graph, just intuitively, it looks like we're selling our banked RECs. Does this graph also incorporate the fact that we get banked RECs every year? It does. But even so, the idea is that we would actually be selling more than we're actually taking in every year. So that at some point in the future, perhaps not 2030, but at some point in the future, we're going to be zero.
Correct, yeah. This graph assumes that we sell all of our 1.2 million banked RECs between now and 2030. Every year we sell 100.
So the assumption is that by the end of 2030, we will be zero.
Correct, yeah. So
am I reading this incorrect? Shouldn't this be at zero? No.
No, so that assumes that we sell that last volume in 2030. So in 2031,
it will be above.
It would be go up to zero, yeah.
Okay.
For the using banked RECs line.
Thank you.
Yeah. So there is a diminishing. That's a good point, though. There is a diminishing opportunity here as our existing contracts expire. There's less surplus to sell, and as the RPS level marches up, there's less headroom that we have there. So that's why there's a kind of an upward slope to these lines here.
Sorry, with respect to, one more follow-up question. This leads into what you were just talking about, was the proposed use of the savings. Have we also considered in some of the proposed expenditures of the savings, would we essentially cut our electrical demand in such a point where we wouldn't need so much in terms of a bank REC? Do you understand what I'm saying or asking?
So if we have, if our demand decreases because of our sustainability efforts, yeah, that's true. That would give us additional volumes to sell, additional surplus.
So past analyses we've been given are that the increase in the EV adoption is going to offset an overall load, the decreases in other consumption, so that we're not expecting to reduce our overall load.
Right. So the idea on the minimally, the idea on the spending the $7 million savings a year is to, one possibility is to increase our EV infrastructure, as you've listed here, and spend that savings to build out EV infrastructure, correct?
That's one possibility, yeah.
Okay.
And we are currently forecasting a decrease in overall load, because of efficiency and behind-the-meter solar, kind of exceeding the gains we get from EV load.
Also, I've seen that we expect our load to fall. That raises our electricity rates for our consumers. I think we need to keep that in mind.
Yeah. Yep.
And in addition to efficiency and solar, industrial customers are leaving. And so that is a large percentage.
They're going to Santa Clara because they have lower rates.
And the value of land is so high here that, manufacturing sites make less sense.
Difficult, but it's actually pretty high in Santa Clara too. They're just getting all the server farms that we used to have. Like, I think, was it HP just moved their server farm? So I really do think I forget how much lower they are than we, but they're substantially cheaper.
Okay. So next steps, as Jonathan mentioned, we'll come back for another discussion with a recommendation, an action item that could go to council. The carbon accounting methodology change does require council approval because it's part of the carbon neutral plan. The RPS compliance strategy is a pretty significant shift potentially, so we would like to get council feedback on that as well. And then depending on the timing of all of that, we could start potentially selling some resources this year, but more likely next year. And then following that, in the next 9 months or so, we'll probably be coming to you with a couple of reports around another very big long-term portfolio decision we have to make related to our new 30-year Western hydro contract, which is up for renewal starting in 2025. So that will have another impact on all of this RPS stuff and carbon accounting stuff that we'll be talking about later.
Does that impact the concession we got? I don't know, that's not the right word, but for the lower,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
it does.
Yeah,
If we
it does.
renew it.
If we don't.
If we don't renew, we're back up with every other.
Correct. If we renew,
Right.
we keep it.
Okay,
Yeah, so it only applies to old contracts essentially, or renewed old contracts. So if we sign a new hydro contract, it wouldn't fall under that exemption.
And
It
then
has to be old.
I had two other little questions. If we used any savings for storage, is it enough money to make much impact on that side where the storage might actually offset some of the carbon that we're buying RECs for off?
That's a good question. It would fund, a pretty significant storage installation that we could use at one of our, locally or one of our solar sites to help shift that generation around and reduce carbon. Do you want to talk about the carbon implications of storage?
Well, it's a large amount of money, but storage is essentially 15% extra load because it's only 85% if we're talking batteries. So you have to do a good job of really dispatching it. And in terms of if you're talking in-city impacts, transportation is where these dollars would go the farthest with whether it's mobility or EVs. And then it comes down to building decarbonization and then storage, because again, our natural load with energy efficiency and behind the meter solar and everything else is actually kind of distributed in cleaner parts of the grid. So.
Sorry, and I had one more just little detailed question on the first slide and part 2, I guess it's page 16. I don't see any wind after, oh, sorry, that's my eyes. I thought it was 2019, 2020.
Yeah, we have one contract expiring at the end of 2021 and another one expiring in 2028. So we have two wind contracts right now.
And there's still a possibility that we'll add wind with some other contracts?
Yep, especially once we make the decision about the western contract. If we reduce that or eliminate that, we might very well replace that with wind.
So when we first discussed this, I remember thinking, bucket one RECs are a higher price because they're a buy California, requirement there, which we don't have, we don't need. But I couldn't find a reason to distinguish from the environmental value of a bucket one REC versus a bucket three REC. Is there a countervailing argument to that?
Are you asking if there's a higher environmental value to bucket one RECs? So I have 3 papers that I will send you, but in general, let's just remember that the max bucket 3 that we could procure for our whole RPS compliance is 10%. It's already very constrained, and so we are already dealing with a constrained market, artificially constrained market, and diverging. So bucket 1 RECs are increasing in price, and bucket 3 RECs are flat or decreasing. And so so that says, even while more RPSs are coming online in the Western Interconnect. So that speaks to sort of an unphysical correlation going on, the artificially constrained market. And the real interesting thing about these papers is that essentially, if you look at yourself as part of the WEC, which now we are actually creating market constructs to do that. I'll be very, no. Yes, yes. But these papers, which we can send you, are just saying that by optimizing over a larger area, you have no net leakage of carbon on the WEC, and you lower prices for everyone. That's what the papers are saying. And we can shop that around to other academics as well.
So it makes sense to me. When the commission first talked about this a year ago, why not go for the cheaper RECs if we can? Same environmental value, and we can sell the higher priced ones to others.
Can I add something just on that? One of the countervailing arguments that comes up regularly is about additionality, whether the prices for some of these things actually.
Yeah, we already agreed the argument applies equally to both buckets.
Well,
and in fact, it probably applies worse in California because we have so much solar here.
I think with bucket one RECs, the fact that there isn't much of a liquid market with bucket one RECs means that generally that requirement forces you to enter into a long-term PPA, which a power purchase agreement, which people agree is instrumental in adding renewable energy to the grid. But when you're buying bucket three RECs that are maybe coming from already established projects, that's where the countervailing argument comes in. And I think there's an argument to be made that Palo Alto's already done its work on additionality, but I think that's where some of the frustration comes from the environmental groups. And if they were to look carefully at those arguments and were to, be concerned about what Palo Alto's portfolio looks like, we would be in a position of having to make that argument ourselves. And then it's just up to us whether we feel comfortable being able to make that public perception argument ourselves. That's all.
All right.
So that's my concern here. I guess if you actually want us to, I view this as a huge change in the direction that Palo Alto has gone since, before I was on council in 2010, right? It'd be a sea change approach to things. That doesn't mean it's not the right approach. Frankly, saving $7 million a year over 10 years, $70 million, it's a large number. I think that's something we'd love to do and be able to do it. I'm just trying to understand how we as Palo Alto would say, we only have 21% renewables. We're gaming the system a little bit. It's what it feels like. We only have 21%. How do I explain to people that we're carbon free? It feels like it just doesn't feel right to tell people that. And we've gone from, we were 50% renewable and 50% carbon free with hydro. If big hydro is considered renewable, we would go around telling everyone we're 100% renewable, right? And so we would no longer really be able to say that. And how does that work?
Well, we're not able to say that now. I mean, that's where comes from a couple years of discussions amongst the commission about how carbon neutral are we or carbon free. When you get to hourly accounting, you find that there are large periods when we aren't.
So we're going to move to hourly accounting, at which point we could just buy more renewables to cover that. We could.
Lisa, go ahead.
Sorry, I think my understanding of the what staff is calling carbon neutral hourly is to consider Palo Alto like an island and not part of the grid, which is different than using hourly average accounting, which is still in the context of the whole grid. So the word hourly can be a bit of a
So
red herring.
I thought we were not going to be an island.
Right.
I thought we decided pretty much, at least the discussions, let's not be an island, doesn't make sense. So assuming that, are we carbon free if we go to the hourly accounting method, not the hourly? That's a good question.
Well, if I may, I just wanted to, because the question that I wanted to ask was, or just to point out, when we talk about saving $7.4 million by going to the minimally compliant, that means we are no longer holding ourselves to Palo Alto carbon neutral standards, such as council defined them back in whatever it was. It means we will just be using the state standards. No? What does it mean? Help me out, then go back to what does it mean to be minimally RPS compliant? I thought that was holding ourselves only to state compliance standards.
Under the current definition that council has approved, we could be considered carbon neutral by buying unbundled RECs. That's permissible. So to the extent that we have market purchases that show up on our power content label, we could buy additional bucket-free RECs and still consider ourselves carbon neutral under a minimally compliant
So the minimal
approach.
is the sum of it means using banked RECs and bucket swapping and selling supplies.
Correct.
I see.
Yeah, and there's lots of different questions in there, right?
Right.
Banked RECs, for example.
Okay, but nobody's suggesting that we let go of Palo Alto's currently established definition of carbon neutral.
No.
But aren't we considering changing it to make it more granular or not? I mean, that confuses me.
Well, so I see it as two problems. One is the accounting.
Right.
And how much, how dirty are we where we have to buy offsets or credits? And the other is, where do we get those offsets or credits? Right. And the accounting, the hourly is more accurate. We're giving a harder look at ourselves. We're being more green, as it were, more honest about it, the opposite of greenwashing. And then where do we get these extra credits? Because there are more periods where we're negative. That's what we're talking about.
So I guess I've always thought about it slightly differently, and I'll just throw it out there, see if you guys have been thinking about it the same way, is that we strive to have 50%, when you jump down my throat a little bit, we strive to have 50% renewables and 50% hydro. And because of the vagaries of the market, sometimes we have to offset with RECs. And that's why council's allowed that, because it's really a wiggle room. It's not the main thing. And the way this looks, and I'm not saying it is, it looks like the wiggle room is now eating up the entire thing here by saying that it's within council, approval. And I know that when we passed this stuff in 2013, I was mayor, that was not the intent. So, and I'm not saying we shouldn't save the $7 million. I'm just saying that's the way it was, at least, I think it was council's understanding at the time we did it. So I'm really asking how that relates to what we're moving forward on.
I think that's the discussion we're having.
Right.
Whether we're moving away from what has been the traditional strategy.
Right, but I think so we have to decide then at least I could not vote right now if I had to vote, right? I mean, I don't have enough information.
I agree.
And so the question I have in my head, and I'm struggling with, and I apologize a little bit, is what information should I ask for? So by the next meeting, if we're asked to vote on this, I know how to vote.
So we ran right into this wall as we were trying to think through, we were looking at the RPS options and saying, well, what is our recommendation? And we weren't 100% sure ourselves because of all these issues that you're talking about right here. And some of the things that we think we need to do. First, there's a lot of discussion we need to have internally to maybe frame this for you folks a little more effectively. Actually, it's very effectively framed, but maybe frame our own recommendations for you. I think, as Lena's mentioned, there are some studies that we need to follow up on that have some really promising positive support for the concepts that we're talking about here that we might be able to use to frame the arguments that the UAC is, I think a lot of UAC members are sort of seeing as instinctively reasonable. The other thing that I think I would like us to do is actually sit down with some of the environmental stakeholders, and both community and broader across the state, and run some of these concepts by them and say, what's your initial reaction to this? If we were to write a press release announcing what we were doing, would you retweet it? Is that, we need validators. It could be Stanford University. I mean, we have a lot of connections with Stanford. We could look at a collaboration with them looking at this concept, and if they came out and said, yeah, this is just as good as what you have right now, and it's cheaper, and you're going to use that money to achieve great sustainability goals, this is a step in the right direction. That would be great. There are also options that we've talked about around having options for customers. It might make sense, for example, for those customers for whom it is really important and intuitive and they're willing to pay extra, to let them have an hourly carbon neutral hourly portfoltfolio if they're willing to pay for it. These are different options that we might consider around our RPS change. But I think the most important thing is trying to get this concept out there a little bit and seeing what the reaction is.
And I just want to back up that, as well as I think there's another sensitivity that you brought up for when we're lobbying at the state level, because this is more of a, it's more of a viewing CalISO as an island in the WEC issue. And so by doing this minimally compliant portfolio, how does that play at sort of the state level and everything that constrained those markets in the first place? But again, the EIM expansion, and there is a plan to roll out this expansion in 2022, it's a different market. This is actually a huge change. And so, this is not the same world.
In the time period between now and our next meeting, it might be worthwhile, particularly for me, the new guys on the block, if staff can remind us of what has transpired in the past from council as direction for the city of Palo Alto, to frame this in perspective of a goal, particularly a long-term goal, since we are talking about 2030. That would be extremely helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I can touch on that real quickly. I think Commissioner Scharf had it exactly right in terms of the history of the carbon neutral plan. In 2013, the objective stated was to rely on RECs initially until we get some hard resources built in the ground, and then to kind of achieve, starting in 2016 or so, rely on about, getting half of our supply from in-state hard resources through long-term contracts for renewables, and then half from hydro. So that's essentially the current directive from council, to pursue renewables as much as we need to in order to reach that level, assuming they don't impact rates too much.
And per our last discussion, thank you very much. Hydro, there are no additional hydro supplies coming online, so we have what is available.
Basically, there are no new hydro resources coming online. There are some hydro resources we've learned about recently that are coming off of contracts with other utilities that we might be able to pick up, but it's not a new resource. It's just shifting from them to us.
So thank goodness our demand is declining, right? If our demand increases, we have a problem. If we're going to keep to 50%, we have a potential problem.
If it was our goal to keep to 50% hydro, but there's, current, renewables contract prices are just as low as what we're paying for hydro or lower. So it's.
So I just need to clarify, when I said that about 50% hydro and 50, that's because of historic. We actually don't care if it was 60% renewable, 40% hydro. What we don't want to have happen, and what we've been always negotiating with the state is, we don't have an RPS requirement, which is, since hydro is not renewable under state law, where they require us to have more, more RPS, like they had a 60% RPS requirement, and we had 55% hydro. That means we would have to spill water, frankly, or sell off our hydro in some way.
I think you were making, if I understood you correctly before, in relating to the qualitative factors slide here, our relationship with state legislators and regulators, their perception of this change in strategy could be a qualitative factor for us in the future if we were to go this way. Is that? That's an interesting thing. And then this is another unrelated point, I think, and completely off the top of my head. But if we were to go this way and we had the savings, perhaps there could be a rate plan for homeowners who rip out all natural gas from their house and turn off the pipe, and it's all electric. Maybe there's some way that they get on a new rate plan or for some period of time to help incentivize that, just if we were to do that.
And I do think perception can be all about framing, because just by lowering rates by 5%, we are incentivizing electrification and EVs. So there are knock-on effects that somebody would love to model.
Can I ask a very basic question? Because going back to the state requirement is 29% renewables. And then I always thought that I understood the city's position of 100% carbon neutral. But I've realized there's a couple slides here that talk about RPS level, and I was misunderstanding it as the state RPS level, because I understand what that is as a percentage, but it seems like there's a percentage that's the city's target. And so my question is, what is the city's percentage target for its RPS?
At this point, the city's target is the same as the state's target. We initially had our own independent target that was higher than the state's target, but now the state has kind of caught up.
So a minimal RPS requirement would be 29% renewable, as much hydro as we get that year, and the rest of it would be buying either offsets or allowances or using our banked recs or, okay.
Yeah, for 2018, when the RPS requirement was 29%, that's right.
Okay, so it would be,
Yeah.
thank you. That clarifies a lot for me.
And then when we speak about RPS level, when Jim, who did all of the work, speaks about RPS level, that's just the percentage of our portfolio that year that was from eligible renewables. So that is different than the RPS minimum set by the state. So I think you okay. I wasn't sure if that was confusing the issue. Like Palo Alto's RPS level is 60%. It only had to be 29%. Just making sure.
So there's the requirement, and there's the amount you actually have achieved year by year.
We're far exceeding.
But minimally compliant would be taking, instead of 60, instead of generating 60% renewable power from our solar projects and wind projects and what have you, we'd be selling the excess.
We're not going to generate
In one of
less.
these columns, anyway, is proposing that. Okay.
Right. We still have those generations. So we're carbon neutral is the policy. We've switched accounting methodologies to hold ourselves to a higher, more exacting standard. I think combining that with the RPS compliance starts to really complicate the issue quite a bit. And then words like minimally compliant creep in, which troubles some of us. So I think when we get back to that, is kind of dissociating the two issues would be helpful on that. And then when we look about our RPS or compliance, we generate enough to meet 100% by state standards, right? 100% hydro plus RPS, and that's not going to change.
Not for some time, anyway. Yeah.
No. So all it has, we have excess RECs in bucket 1 that we don't monetize, and for the 17,000 additional metric tons we need to cover under the more exacting standard, how do we cover that to maintain our carbon neutrality? and maybe bucket 3 is cheaper way to do it. But we don't want to backslide in terms of carbon neutrality. We're holding ourselves higher.
Right, I think the UAC started asking about this because we felt that it was using, that the current system was using carbon accounting a little too liberally, and so being bedazzled by a $7 million savings, just to be clear, is going in the opposite direction in terms of being strict with ourselves, in terms of how we wanted to be over-compliant.
So,
rather than under.
Greg asked a good question. What additional information would we want for next meeting? I think better understanding of what we do with our RECs now, how we use them, and the like would be, how we account for the shortfall now when we buy those. That would be, I don't understand that as well as I should after being on the commission as long as I have. So that would be good to cover, I think.
I thought I read somewhere that there's restrictions on the communications to customers.
On the power content label itself.
Right.
We can't have any disclaimers about how this number doesn't really reflect our true carbon content, you know.
So I would like to understand what those limitations are when we think about what we're going to change.
There's a pretty strict template. We can't change anything really. We just have to plug in our values, and it shows, you know, this portfolio equals 100 pounds per megawatt hour of carbon emissions over the course of the year. And
but are we allowed additional messaging and no, that's it. You can't communicate about it other than that.
I don't think so, no.
Let me ask the commission this, because we've gone way over time on this. We're going to have another shot at this. Shall we move on to the next agenda item, or does people want to take more time on this one right now?
So I'm happy to move on. I'm happy to move on to the next agenda item. My only concern is, I'm almost wondering if we should have another meeting on this before we're asked to vote. And that's not normally my style, but I do, and give staff a chance to frame these questions, because at this point, I'm not even sure what to ask staff. I was personally just going to think about it and send them emails about what I wanted to see. But the better approach really would be if we came back and had another discussion. I don't know, maybe you guys are sick of discussing it.
No, I think that I had similar thoughts going through.
Okay.
So I think the best thing before what we'll do is we'll take your comments with what we can come up with and some thought processes that we can look at. And then since we don't have a meeting next month, we'll come back to you in August and we'll have another conversation about this. And we won't ask for any kind of recommendations. Then we'll go from there. So I think that'd probably be the best way, if that's okay with the commission. Okay? Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I also wanted to mention I am a member of Carbon Free Palo Alto as well. I'm glad to see the city is trying to address the natural gas leakage issue, because this leakage can actually double the impact of natural gas in terms of the greenhouse gas effects, which would make it about the same as burning coal. And I don't think that's where we really want to go. And so when I read through the report, there's two things that stood out that are not accounted for correctly. And the first one is the global warming potential of methane. It's actually 86 times CO2, as Tom alluded to, because it should be taken in the 20-year time frame, not the 100-year time frame. If we do the 100-year time frame, we're cooked. You know, plan it over. We really only have 10 years to solve this. So the 20-year time frame is the appropriate measurement to use. The second thing is that the city in the paper is just accounting for the leakage within the city. But when we do transmission losses for electricity, we include the entire grid. And now when we do natural gas, we just draw this little line around our city and say, well, that's it. that's not the real impact. The real impact is the entire source system. This includes the leakage in Los Angeles with the big storage facility on there and all these other things that are associated with our natural gas. So true accounting with the greater greenhouse potential and, as was alluded to in some of the earlier slides, more like a 5% leakage rate is appropriate. Once we do this true accounting, now we have really good information to move forward on electrification. This will again put the true price of natural gas where it needs to be, and using the greater amount of the cost of per ton equivalent of CO2, all these things will help put natural gas in its correct place. It's not a clean fuel, it's a fossil fuel. And so I think those are really some good points that we should spend equal amount of time on as you are with this accounting for the carbon in our electricity supply, which is already carbon neutral. Let's spend the time addressing the larger portion of our carbon footprint, which is our natural gas supply. And just one last thing about the RECs. Just looking at the 50,000-foot level or even greater, there are two accounting systems. One is man's accounting system, and one is nature's accounting system. Nature says if you burn fossil fuels, you're in trouble. Man says, well, let's see, I can do some RECs, and I can do some counting here, and I can do this and that. And so, we can kind of shift things around. In the end, there are no RECs because we have to be 100% off fossil fuels. So take this into account when you're thinking about this, and let's not get distracted by some of man's accounting. I know it applies in the world today, but in the world tomorrow, where we are truly carbon constrained, saving the $7 million is just a shell game and is not reducing our actual carbon. The real thing is the carbon. So be careful with this, can we just buy RECs and solve everything? It doesn't go that way. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. One thing relates to what David just said and also what Commissioner Scharf had raised is this conundrum between the RECs and offsets. And a lot of people confuse them. And in fact, when I listened to David, I had to keep substituting the word offsets. In the long run, there's no real offsets. You have to stop emitting carbon. But the one way to look at what is a REC and what is an offset, a REC is a rigorously tracked attribute from, say, a Wyoming wind generator that is hard metered and then tracked by an accounting system into accounts, and those are audited. A offset is a very different thing. It's a counterfactual calculation about what someone would have done if you didn't pay them not to do this thing they said they would have done without the money. So here I am holding a gun to a tree and demanding it, you pay me and I'll save this tree. And then that will be an offset. You'll say one tree saved. But you don't know if I really would have shot the tree. And so they're different that way. So I'm kind of different than a lot of environmentalists. I really do trust RECs. They're audited. I worry a bit about offsets. I end up buying them anyway for my past, but okay. The other thing is about the leakage and the different time frames. So the methane goes into the atmosphere and it can be oxidized if there's enough ozone up there. Ozone's a very reactive gas. We're running out of it. If there's enough, it can destroy that or oxidize that methane molecule into CO2. And that gives methane on average about a 12-year life up there. Each molecule has an average of 12-year life. And if we take its warming potential and divide it, all the warming it did in 12 years, if we divide it by a big denominator of 100 years, we've lowered the apparent warming that it did per year. And so that's the reason we're saying we think you ought to be looking at this shorter 20-year time frame, which essentially recognizes a smaller denominator, and so the full 4 times as big effect of fugitive emissions. And then the last thing was my former coworker Carl Knapp had introduced to council, and council adopted a great prudency policy dealing with a future cost when cap and trade was in the future and it hadn't started yet. And so the council adopted a policy of recognizing that it was very likely to occur and that they ought to start making decisions as though it would occur. That way they wouldn't regret any of the decisions they make. And the same thing can be done when we start thinking of all the carbon we're going to have to remove from the atmosphere. That'll cost, say, over $100 a ton. And they need to be removing about 25% of global emissions, current global emissions. So almost 25% of the volume we're emitting now has to be removed at over 100 a ton. So us being, me a commissioner elsewhere and you guys here, we're in the long run prudency business. So we ought to work on policies that recognize the long run costs of emitting. And so we really find it's worth paying up to $100 a ton in order to avoid emitting now. Anyway, thanks for considering those things.
Not much more to say after those two got through with it. But I am very happy to see fugitive emissions being studied. I know that within the city, what we're studying is a small portion of the fugitive emissions of the total supply. At the end of the memo that is part of the packet, it does say that it's probably, well, could be 4 times more emitted leaking outside of Palo Alto than inside Palo Alto. So we're really kind of just looking at a very small part of the overall methane emissions leakage. But most important, I think, is how where are these numbers going to show up? So where is this fugitive emission number going to show up? I think I've seen it mentioned once in one account in one of the SCAP reports, buried very deeply. But whenever we show our footprint, at least officially on the Palo Alto website or in our staff reports, we're never showing and outlining where the fugitive emissions are. In fact, they're ignored for the most part in the official accounts. But wouldn't it be an amazing news item to see that Palo Alto's footprint for its buildings doubled or tripled overnight? You know, if we start recognizing this and say we're standing up and we're putting this actually in the reality into our accounts, and we're helping our planning efforts to focus on the right actions and make the right investments, because we know that this leakage is causing this additional global warming that is nowhere to be found in any of the official reports. That's a very big step that Palo Alto can take. So my big question for this is where can we put, where are these numbers going to show up if we start recognizing methane leakage as providing a significant amount of global warming compared to what the natural gas is itself? You know, just the burning of the gas is a small amount of the warming if you consider the leakage that's going on in the whole supply chain. So I'm hoping that at some point, and it may be, you know, this will be officially recognized at some point when California has completed some more of its studies on methane leakage. On the EPA website, it says 2.3%. At 2.3%, that's kind of an official number that's recognized by even our own federal government. But that in itself almost doubles the footprint if you think about a 20-year time frame for methane. So there's really no reason why we shouldn't be at least calling that out in our own planning and our own presentation of the footprint for natural gas use in our city. Thank you.
Very brief. I don't have a presentation on this. This was prompted by a question from Commissioner Forcell about what our emissions are, how much gas leaks from Palo Alto's distribution system. And I guess what I would say is we don't know for sure. we have two sources of information that give you some, maybe bound the problem a little bit. The first is a 2012 study that we did to determine whether we needed to be reporting to the estimated gas leakage to the EPA, and that calculation yielded about 4,700 metric tons of carbon being emitted due to leakage and oxidization on our system. It uses a lot of sort of nationwide assumptions, so it's not necessarily Palo Alto specific. It is a relatively small number relative to our total emissions, which are in the ballpark of 150,000 to 160,000. The other sorts of information we have is something we track every year, which is called unaccounted for gas. And that is the difference between the gas that we read off the meters at the 4 stations where we take gas off of PG&E's system, and the total sales that we meter over that same period of time. So if we received X and sold Y, the difference between that ranges between 1.5% to 3%. Now, metering is an imprecise science. 2% is our standard. 2% measuring error is a standard for a meter that you can keep in the field. So not all of that 1.5% to 3% is released to the atmosphere. That is for sure. How much of that 1.5% to 3% is actually being released to the atmosphere is an open question for us and would require further study. So this was an effort to get some information in front of the commission for what had originally been a light agenda. This is the information that we have, and we wanted to get this in front of the commission to get some idea of what future research or study you'd like to see from us and what level of priority you'd like to make this. And I do want to emphasize that Palo Alto does do far more than the DOT requires to repair and search for leaks. PG&E is slowly starting to catch up because of all the additional focus on safety that they've done, but Palo Alto goes way above and beyond most gas utilities in trying to fix leaks. So I would assume that our leakage rate, our actual emissions to the atmosphere are lower than many other utilities. So that's what I have to say, and please, happy to answer any questions.
Well, thanks for putting this together. It's super helpful. I would like to see methane estimated at the 20-year level and not the 100-year level. I think that's a more fair accounting for that. And it would also be, interesting to understand if we upgraded the most vulnerable pipes, how much of an impact that might have on reducing emissions and what that cost would be to reduce those.
Yeah, and this is actually another place where Palo Alto actually has excelled. So that I can take that as something that we should go back and study. But I do also just want to highlight some of Palo Alto's sort of aggressive replacement that we've done of some of our. So we had of ABS pipe. Do we want to talk about that at all?
So I think the thing is if you look at just even in this figure 1 portion of it, you look at this unaccountable percentage of gas, you can see the chub bar is actually closing, going down into the 2018 portion of it. And I think the thing is that's due to, after we do these leak surveys, we go out and we actually are replacing the oldest gas pipe that's out there. We have had a mixture of PVC pipe. We have ABS that we just got rid of. And we still have, and then everything else is high-density polyethylene. They're gas pipe. And so I'd say maybe about 55% of the system right now is in the high density aspect of it. So I think the thing is that that's the reason why we see that these leakages going down over the system portion of it. And I think the thing is that we can go back and look at, we send this report from our leakage on an annual basis to the DOT. So we can go back and look at, what we did 10 years ago. We can go back and see what we did. I don't know how far the reports actually go back, but we'll go back as far as we can and take a look at that portion of it. But we can calculate over the period of time. But I think as we continue to move forward, we are looking at the oldest pipe that's still out there. And now we are into this PVC section of pipe, which is probably around 45 miles.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
I think so, about 45 miles worth of PVC main end that's out there that we're in the process right now of replacing. It's probably going to be somewhere, my guesses will be is that that's probably an 8 to 10 year time frame. Maybe a little shorter than that, maybe actually about 5 to 7 years at that point. So it will take us a little bit of time, and then at that point, the system will be pretty much then all steel and high density pipe.
And we do have data on leak rates by
segment of pipe.
Yeah, we have data on leak rates by material. Because that's what you're looking for, right? Is the impact of replacing the highest leak potential pipes. Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
The other piece of data it'd be good to know is if PG&E tracks or estimates their leakage from their system. It would be helpful. When we talked Monday, you didn't know if that data was available, and if it's not available, it's not.
It should be available. So they're mandated to report that to the Air Resources Board, so we can bring that back as well.
Thanks. All right. Any more comments or questions?
Just a quick one. Thank you. This is like chock full of good information. Just wanted to second the notion that we should be using a 20-year time horizon. When I brought this up last month, it was in the context of wondering if there was any appetite on the UAC or council or in the community for expanding the green gas program to offset not just consumed and combusted natural gas, but to account for fugitive emissions as well. And so to my mind, that would include transmission as well as distribution. It's great to have a start on understanding how well we're able to estimate distribution. But to Commissioner Danaher's point, it would be great to understand transmission as well. All that said, I feel like it's premature to do a deep dive into another set of thinking about carbon accounting, and we really should prioritize the electric portfolio, because I think we will find that some similar themes and thinking will apply to thinking about the gas. So this is not a request to come back next month, but eventually.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think what we can do is we'll put it on the future agenda portion of it and bring it back before the end of the year. I think that's fair, that we can go ahead and go back and, as Jonathan says, we have pipe type, we have leakage portions of it, we have records that go back. So we'll go back and take a look at it from a deeper dive portion of it. And then I think the other thing is, as Jonathan mentioned too, is that we can go to CARB and look at some of the transmission pieces and probably PG&E's distribution systems as well from that point.
Sorry, I have one other comment. With respect to Figure 1, thank you for going through that. The 1% drop between 2016 and 2018, you attributed primarily to the replacement of existing pipeline distribution, right? And then we highlighted that we have roughly 40 to 45% yet to go, and that will take approximately 5 to 7 years. Do we anticipate another 1% drop over that period?
I would believe so. I would, because the problem what's happening is that with the PVC pipe that's in the ground today, it's basically, when it was put in, it's basically like your sprinkler pipe. That's all it is. And so what we're finding is that, and what we're mostly concerned about is when the earth's shifting right now, is that the glue that's holding the joints in place are actually kind of deteriorated. But the ground is so compacted at this period of time, as long as the pipe doesn't shift, we're not finding that many leaks out there. But what we have found is when we were doing the work on University, when the contractor was shaking the ground a little bit out there, was they were cutting the trench line, we found that there was actually a couple leaks out there. Actually, it broke apart. The line just separated where the joints. So we're more concerned about that. And like I say, so we want to try to move a little quicker and trying to get this PVC out of the system. One of the advantages that we have over PG&E is that we only have a 25-pound system. We only put 25 pounds of gas through our whole system, where PG&E will run 60 to 90 pounds. And then what's actually going into our homes is actually regulated down to a quarter of a pound. That's all it goes inside the home at that point.
Are you referencing the fact that it's harder to do pressure testing on the lines?
No, I'm just saying is that the reason why we're not seeing the leakage that you would normally see, if we had the pressure that what PG&E had with PVC pipe, we'd have
a much larger leak.
Yeah, we would have leaks everywhere at that point. But with the lower end pressure that we have on the pipes right now, we're not seeing the leakage. But we know where all this pipe is at, so that's why I said we can wait 5 years to start, and we're in the process right now of replacing.
Thank you.
All right, Commissioners, okay if we move on to the next agenda item? All right, these next two will be very quick, I think. Update on the fiber planning?
So thank you. So just a quick update on this is that we are planning on going to June 24th here at the end of the month to go to Council with a fiber update with a reissuing of an RFP and then maybe some new scope ideas on that. We're looking at more of a phased approach. The other thing is that Council approved in November the AMI authorization for us to move forward with our AMI, and one of the things that we want to do is we want to build fiber out to where the collectors are going to go for the AMI instead of using cellular backhaul.
AMI is the smart meter.
Smart meter, sorry. And then also too is that we're looking at adding some fiber further into the residential areas to switches and transformers, so that we can respond to outages a little bit quicker with that portion of it. And that's all in this new scope of work that will be going on. We'll evaluate hopefully by that period of time back in August, and then we'll see at that point when we award the contract. We'll go back to council at that period of time and award in October. And then hopefully we can start doing some work in the first of the year then at that point. So the big key is that going to council here on June 24th with that RFP. Questions?
I have just one question. And this is related back to the previous discussion with respect to digging up an additional 40 to 45% of the lines. And I think it's just an operational question. I'm just not familiar. Many cities, and I think Palo Alto also has a one dig policy. You dig once or dig once policy. And I think we've talked about this in the past. Is this something that is also considered when we're talking about extending the fiber line out to either the AMIs or to the smart reader locations? Are we looking at also combining that work with other work? Is that something that you typically do in your operations?
Typically what we end up doing is that on any kind of electrical upgrades that we do, so if we go from overhead to underground, or if we go from an underground area that needs to be rebuilt because it's coming into life and we need to get some redundancy maybe back in that, because the older systems and the underground systems, it's what they call a radial feed, so it's only a one-way feed. Where now when we build redundancy portion of it, then we'll add fiber conduit in place at that period of time. This last work that was done on University, there was about 2,700 linear feet that was put in University. We actually put two 2-inch fiber lines in going down there. So anytime that we can do it, we'll go ahead and put fiber in conduits. The thing what we don't do is that when we talk about the water, gas, wastewater side, so when we're actually doing work on that side of the plant, we do not add fiber to that. And the reason for that is that if you think about it, usually the electric's on one side of the street and all the water, gas, wastewater side is on the other. And so if you start putting conduit down the left-hand side of the street, and then you stop with the electric portion of it, but then you come along 4 blocks down, and now you have more conduit if you're going to do with water, maybe it's a water replacement program. Now it's going to be on the wrong side of the street. So now you're going to have to try to, we're going to have all this conduit that's going to be going across the street from box to box. So we've decided that the method right now is to stick it with the electric side. And it seems to be that's where COM is already there, AT&T, Comcast is already on that side of the street. So instead of trying to go back and forth, because again, we got storm drains that go down the middle of the streets, we would be ripping that conduit up all the time. And if we do put fiber in there, we would have to be shutting that down. So we try to stay on one side, and we always try to locate it with the electric side.
Thank you.
Is it possible to see this RFP before it goes out?
Yes, Chair Danaher asked me that what I can do is I can go ahead and forward it to you, and then I can let you know if you have any questions, you can feel free, but I'll send it out to you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, any more? Then any more comments or questions on this topic? Good. We'll, last item was the water leak bill credits. Just summarize.
So I'll summarize this portion. Is basically what we wanted to do is we just wanted to bring this back. We talked about it during the budget timeframe. If you remember, is that when we came to you with our budget increases, one of the things that we had talked about is that we were going to add $25,000 into the customer service fund portion of it because what we're finding is that we set the annual budget for $50,000, but if you notice is that we're spending right now approximately about $59,000 on 131 customers, and the average is about 373 is the rebate portion of it. So that is cost of water credits, as well as some of it is irrigation repairs. We allow that portion of it to be there, or if there was a fixture that was broken or something like that, if the customer goes out and sends back the receipt portion of it, we are actually able to do that. We didn't put a max line on credit on that, was $2,500, and we've never seen any of that come through. So this was authorized by council. And then, like I said, one of the things, so I wanted to bring it back to you and just let you know that we did add it and that we were going to go ahead and move this up to the $75,000 fund at this period of time.
Okay. We wrapped up one at that. The last item is always topics for the next, for our rolling calendar. We'll have another topic about our RPS, another conversation about our RPS strategy in August. But any other requests for this rolling calendar?
A couple of months ago, we talked about the kind of the ordinance for neighborhoods that wanted to keep their utilities totally underground, and and I just wondered if we were going to see something back on that.
So where that is right now is that, forgive me, I don't remember exactly when we're going to council with that. We are going to council with, we talked about, that I think what I got out of the conversations that we had is the day times of the notifications and the amounts, we were going to go ahead and create more time for the customer to be notified what they needed to do during that period of time. So it's going to move to council at this point, and council will give us some, we're going to put the same, basically same recommendation, but we made some changes in with your recommendations that you gave us. It goes, I don't know if it goes this month or it's going to go in August when council comes back. So it's not planned to come back to the UAC other than just an update. I thought maybe what I'll do is I'll bring it back as just an update, informational real quick to let you know what council came up with and what we're going to do with Green Acres.
All right, thank you.
We've gone later than we like to go. Any other comments on the rolling calendar? Then the motion to adjourn? So moved. All in favor? All right, we're done. Thank you.